She was the most powerful woman in the building. He was the man nobody noticed. And on a Tuesday afternoon in front of 200 employees, she walked across a crowded cafeteria and kissed him, because someone dared her to. The room exploded with laughter. But Mason Reed didn't laugh. He stood up slowly, looked her directly in the eyes, and kissed her back. And just like that, the laughter died. What happened next would cost them both everything they thought they knew about love, dignity, and what it truly means to stay when life gets ugly. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The cafeteria at Hartwell Media Group was the kind of place that told you exactly where you stood in the company without anyone having to say a word. The executive table sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, where afternoon light caught the chrome edges of expensive watches and the gloss of freshly pressed suits. That table was loud, always loud, filled with the kind of confident laughter that came from people who had never once worried about whether their card would decline at a grocery store. The middle tables belonged to the mid-level managers and senior staff. Decent food, decent conversation, the comfortable hum of people who had found their lane and were reasonably happy staying in it. Then there was the back section. That was Mason Reed's territory. Not by assignment, not by any official policy, just by the natural gravitational pull of invisibility that seemed to follow Mason wherever he went inside this building. He had worked at Hartwell for 2 years and 8 months, and he could count on one hand the number of executives who knew his name. His badge said Financial Analysis, Junior Tier, which in corporate language translated roughly to present, necessary, forgettable. Mason was fine with that, or at least he had trained himself to be fine with it. He sat with his tray, chicken sandwich, side salad, black coffee, and opened the budget spreadsheet on his laptop that he'd been trying to finish since 7 that morning. His left knee bounced under the table. It always did when he was tired, and Mason was always tired. The kind of tired that didn't go away after one good night's sleep because there hadn't been a good night's sleep in about 3 years. He was 32 years old and felt 45. Sophie had woken up twice the night before, once with a bad dream about a wolf, once because she'd knocked her stuffed elephant off the bed and couldn't reach it from the mattress. Mason had padded into her room both times in the dark, half asleep, finding the elephant, tucking her back in, standing there in the doorway for an extra minute, just watching her breathe, because that was the part of parenting nobody warned you about. That you'd stand in doorways at 2 a.m. watching your kid sleep and feel something so enormous it had no name. Sophie was 7. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown with flecks of amber, and Mason's stubborn streak, which meant she was either going to be incredibly successful someday or completely exhausting. Probably both. He bit into his sandwich and scrolled through a column of quarterly numbers that were not adding up the way they were supposed to. And he was so locked inside that problem that he almost didn't notice when the energy in the cafeteria shifted. Almost. But you couldn't miss it, really. It was the kind of shift that happened at a party when someone important walked in. That ripple effect of attention swinging in one direction. Voices dropping half a register. People suddenly sitting up straighter. Mason looked up. Olivia Bennett had entered the cafeteria. He'd seen her before, of course. Everyone at Hartwell had seen her. You couldn't work in this building and not know who Olivia Bennett was. Her face was on the company's annual reports, on the framed photographs in the lobby, occasionally on the business section of the Tribune when Hartwell made a significant acquisition or announced record quarterly earnings. She was 30 years old, which made her one of the youngest CEOs in Chicago's media landscape, and that fact alone generated a specific kind of attention wherever she went. A mixture of admiration and scrutiny that Mason suspected was exhausting to live inside of. She was also undeniably beautiful in the way that powerful people sometimes were, not despite the pressure they carried, but somehow refined by it. Dark hair pulled back in a way that managed to look both professional and effortless. A burgundy blazer that probably cost more than Mason's monthly rent. She moved through the cafeteria with the particular confidence of someone who had learned very early that rooms tended to reorganize themselves around her. Behind her were 3 members of her executive team, Derek Holt, the COO, who laughed too loudly at everything, Priya Summers, head of partnerships, who always looked like she was calculating something, and James Whitfield, chief strategy officer, who was currently saying something in Olivia's ear that made her smile. Mason watched for about 2 seconds before returning to his spreadsheet. He had quarterly projections due by 4 o'clock, and the lives of executives were not his department. He heard the commotion before he understood what was causing it. It started as laughter, that particular frequency of group laughter that carries an edge, the kind that signals someone is either about to be celebrated or humiliated, and the difference between those two outcomes is often thinner than people think. Mason looked up again. Derek Holt had climbed onto his chair. Actually, climbed onto it, standing above the executive table like a man who had perhaps had a lunchtime drink he shouldn't have. And he was making an announcement. Mason was too far away to catch all of it, but he caught the shape of it. Something about a dare, something about a challenge, something about Olivia. And then the word him accompanied by a pointed finger. The finger was pointing at Mason Reed. His stomach dropped. The laughter that followed was full room. 200 people swinging their attention toward the back corner where the quiet junior analyst sat alone with his chicken sandwich and his spreadsheet, and Mason felt every single one of those gazes land on him like something physical. He didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. Across the cafeteria, he saw Olivia Bennett turn to look at where Derek was pointing. She said something, probably a protest, but Derek was already encouraging the crowd, and the crowd was already doing what crowds do, which is escalate. "Kiss the quiet guy in the corner," someone shouted. More laughter. Phones appeared. Of course phones appeared. This was 2024 and nothing happened in public without being immediately documented and distributed. Mason watched Olivia's face from across the room. Even at distance, he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The CEO math of reading a situation and determining the lowest cost path through it. She probably expected him to laugh awkwardly, waver off, sink lower in his chair. She probably expected this to be a 30-second non-event that gave Derek his moment and dissolved without consequence. She probably didn't expect what Mason did next. He closed his laptop. The thing about being invisible for long enough is that it stops feeling like a condition and starts feeling like a choice. And the moment Mason closed that laptop, something shifted in him. Some internal lever that had been stuck in the same position for 3 years finally moved. He was tired of being invisible. Not angry about it. Not bitter. Just tired. He stood up. The cafeteria noise dipped slightly, just slightly, as people registered the movement. The quiet guy in the corner was standing up. He picked up his coffee, took one unhurried sip, set it back down on the table, and then he began walking. Not toward the exit, toward Olivia Bennett. He heard someone near him mutter, "What is he doing?" and then a wave of phone screens tilting in his direction as he crossed the cafeteria floor. He was aware of the attention, the way you're aware of cold water when you jump in. Fully, completely, every nerve. But he kept walking because stopping now would be worse than whatever came next. Olivia saw him coming. For a fraction of a second, her composure cracked. Just a fraction. A blink that lasted slightly too long, a barely perceptible straightening of her spine. She had expected him to stay in his corner. She had not accounted for the possibility that he would come to her. She also had not accounted for the fact that when Mason Reed finally stopped playing invisible, he was someone worth noticing. He stopped about 2 feet in front of her. The cafeteria had gone almost completely quiet now. Up close, Olivia Bennett was different than the version of her on lobby photographs. She looked tired around the eyes. There was a small scar on her chin, barely visible, that makeup hadn't fully covered. She smelled like something clean and expensive, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Part challenge, part something else. "You don't have to do this," Mason said quietly. Just to her, not performing for the room. Olivia blinked. "Do what?" "Whatever they're daring you to do." He said it without heat, without sarcasm, just a statement. "You don't have to." Something moved across her face, and then to his complete surprise, Olivia Bennett leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't long. It was a real kiss, just for a moment, warm and close. And then she pulled back. The cafeteria exploded. But Mason wasn't performing for the cafeteria. He was looking at Olivia. Her eyes were open and she was looking back at him, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Something unguarded and uncertain in a way that the lobby photographs had never shown. And Mason, operating entirely on 3 years of accumulated exhaustion and some internal override he hadn't known he possessed, cupped her face gently with one hand and kissed her back. Properly. The noise in the room shifted from excitement to something stunned. When he stepped back, the cafeteria was completely silent. Olivia stood perfectly still. There was color in her face. Her composure, that impeccable CEO composure that covered the lobby of this building in framed photographs, was visibly fractured, and she didn't seem to know what to do with that. Mason picked up his bag from the table. "Have a good afternoon, Ms. Bennett," he said, and walked out of the cafeteria without looking back. Behind him, the room remained silent. He spent the rest of the afternoon waiting to be fired. That wasn't an irrational expectation. He had just kissed the CEO of the company in front of 200 witnesses and roughly 14 cell phone cameras. In the economy of workplace consequences, that seemed like exactly the kind of thing that ended with a cardboard box and an escort from security. Mason sat at his desk and finished his quarterly projections. Because what else was he supposed to do? Not finish the quarterly projections? And he ignored the looks from his colleagues and the buzzing of his phone, which was apparently receiving messages from people he barely knew because the cafeteria video had already been circulating internally. At 3:47 p.m., his desk phone rang. "Mason Reed," he answered. "Mr. Reed." The voice was professional, clipped. "This is Carol from Miss Bennett's office. She'd like a brief meeting with you at 4:30, if you're available." "If you're available." As though he would decline. "I'll be there," he said. He sat for a moment after hanging up, staring at the spreadsheet on his screen. The numbers didn't mean anything to him right now. "She wants to see you," his colleague Tyler had told him after the cafeteria incident, with the wide eyes of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. "Dude, you kissed the CEO." "She kissed me first," Mason had said. "She was dared to," Tyler said. "You kissed her back on purpose." Mason hadn't had a good answer to that. House. The executive floor was a different atmosphere from the rest of the building. Quieter, carpeted, the air tasting faintly of money in the way that very expensive offices sometimes did. Mason had been up here twice before, both times to deliver reports in person when email hadn't been sufficient. He'd never been inside Olivia Bennett's actual office. Carol, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression of careful neutrality, led him down the hallway. Olivia's office was large but not ostentatious. City view through floor-to-ceiling windows. A desk that was buried under actual paper. Documents, folders, printed reports covered in handwritten notes in the margins. A small framed photograph on the corner of the desk that Mason noticed but couldn't see clearly. No trophy wall, no shelf of awards, no ego furniture. Just the organized chaos of someone who was actually working. Olivia was standing at the windows when he came in. She was still in the burgundy blazer, but her posture was different from the cafeteria. She was holding herself slightly more carefully, the way people do when they've had time to think about something and haven't fully resolved it. She turned when he entered. "Close the door," she said. He did. A silence settled between them that was not comfortable. Olivia looked at him the way someone looks at a situation they'd been trying to categorize and failing. "I want to apologize," she said finally. Mason hadn't expected that. For what? For the cafeteria. She didn't hedge it, didn't dress it up. What Derek did was immature and inappropriate, and I should have shut it down immediately instead of... She stopped. Instead of what I actually did. "You mean instead of kissing me?" "Yes." She held eye contact. "That was not professional, and it wasn't fair to you. I don't know what I was thinking." Mason considered her for a moment. There was something genuine in how she was saying this, not the polished CEO version of an apology, the kind with legal language and implications of non-disclosure. This was a person who felt bad about something they'd done and was saying so. "You gave Derek Holt exactly what he wanted," Mason said. Olivia frowned slightly. "What?" "The dare. You went along with it. You gave him the moment. He wasn't saying it to be cruel. That's the part that bothered him, right? That I didn't react the way he expected. Not you." She studied him for a moment. "You're observant." "I've had a lot of quiet time to watch people." Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. "Derek is a problem I'm handling," I figured. Mason looked around the office briefly, taking in the papers, the city view, the organized mess. Is that all you wanted to say? Olivia seemed caught slightly off guard by the directness of the question. Yes, primarily. I also wanted to make sure you weren't planning any kind of formal complaint. I'm not. You'd be within your rights to. I know. He looked at her steadily. Are you planning to fire me? No. Then I think we're fine. Another silence. This one was different. Less tense, more uncertain, the quiet of two people who have said what they came to say and found that the conversation has not quite resolved itself. You work in financial analysis, Olivia said. Not a question. She'd clearly looked him up. Junior tier, Mason confirmed. How long have you been with the company? 2 years? 8 months? Do you like it? He paused, considering whether to give her the professional answer or the honest one. Something about the directness of the question made him choose honest. It pays my rent, he said, and the benefits are good. My daughter's covered, my grandfather's covered. So yes, I like it fine. You have a daughter. 7 years old, Sophie. Olivia nodded slowly, and again there was something moving across her face that was harder to read than the standard CEO register. I'm sorry, I didn't know. You don't need to be sorry about that. He picked up his bag. I should let you get back to work. He was almost to the door when she spoke again. For what it's worth, Olivia said, nobody has ever done that before. Mason turned. Done what? She met his eyes. Told me I didn't have to. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once and left. 3 days passed. Mason did not think about Olivia Bennett, or more precisely, he thought about her the way you think about something you've decided not to think about, which is to say, frequently and usually at inconvenient moments. He thought about her Tuesday morning when he was making Sophie's lunch and the radio was playing something soft in the background. He thought about her Wednesday night at the hospital, sitting in the waiting area while his grandfather finished his cardiology appointment, watching the fluorescent light flicker above the vending machine. He thought about her Thursday afternoon in the middle of a particularly tedious budget reconciliation, which felt like an appropriately stupid time for a person to show up in your thoughts. What he didn't expect was for her to show up in person. He was putting on his jacket at his desk at 5:15 on Thursday, running slightly late because Sophie's after-school program ended at 5:30, and the commute was exactly 22 minutes if he caught the express, when he heard someone behind him. Mr. Reed. He turned. Olivia Bennett was standing at the edge of his cubicle. No executive team, no Carol, just her, in a gray coat, holding a cup of coffee she'd clearly gotten from the floor below because the good coffee was on floors 8 and up, and Mason worked on floor 4 where the coffee was terrible. He stared at her for a moment. Ms. Bennett, I know you're leaving, she said quickly. This will only take a minute. I wanted to... She stopped, seemed to recalibrate. I had a difficult day, and I found myself thinking about what you said. In my office. Which part? The part about Derek getting exactly what he wanted. She turned the cup in her hands. I've been thinking about it for 3 days. I don't usually let comments from junior employees. She caught herself. I mean, junior tier, Mason said. I didn't mean it like that. I know. He wasn't offended. What do you want, Miss Bennett? She looked at him with an expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure. I don't know how to talk to people who don't want something from me, she said finally, and the bluntness of it seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. Mason picked up his bag and his jacket. He had 14 minutes to make his train. Walk with me to the elevator, he said. I need to catch the 5:20. She fell into step beside him, and for the length of a hallway and a short elevator ride, Olivia Bennett, CEO of a billion-dollar media company, walked alongside a junior financial analyst who was going to be late picking up his daughter if the train didn't run on time. What did you mean? She asked in the elevator. When you said you've had a lot of quiet time to watch people? Mason looked at the elevator doors. My wife died 4 years ago, he said. The way you say things you've said enough times that they've stopped breaking your voice. After that, I didn't really do much talking for a while. Mostly just watched, listened. The elevator reached the lobby. I'm sorry, Olivia said softly. So am I. He started toward the door, then paused. You asked me Thursday if I liked my job. Same question back. Do you like yours? She blinked. Nobody ever asked Olivia Bennett that question. You could see it in her face. That's complicated, probably, Mason said. That's what I thought. He pushed open the lobby door. Good night, Miss Bennett. He made the 5:20 by 40 seconds. The friendship, such as it was, began in the most awkward and unlikely way possible. Olivia started taking her coffee breaks on the 4th floor. Not every day. Maybe twice a week. And she never announced it. She'd simply appear in the break room near Mason's cubicle with a book or her phone, occupying a corner table the way someone might occupy a park bench in the middle of a busy city, claiming a particular quality of quiet. The first time it happened, Mason's colleagues lost their minds. Why is she here? Tyler whispered behind Mason's monitor. Why is the CEO on our floor? She likes the coffee, Mason said. Nobody likes the coffee on 4, Mason. The coffee on 4 tastes like sadness. Go back to work, Tyler. It took about 2 weeks before Mason started joining her, not because he'd planned to. One afternoon, he simply found himself in the break room at the same time, and it would have been strange to leave, and so he poured his terrible coffee and sat down across from her. And they talked for 20 minutes about a city council infrastructure vote that neither of them had a professional stake in, but both had apparently been following. It was the first conversation Mason had enjoyed in a very long time. Olivia, it turned out, was funny. Not in the polished, executive-approved way she was at company events, witty and appropriate and audience-conscious. She was funny in the sharp, slightly dark way of someone who had seen enough of how the world actually operated to find it genuinely absurd. She had opinions about things that had nothing to do with Hartwell Media. She read 3 newspapers before 7 a.m., not for professional reasons, just because she'd been doing it since her father had first handed her a Tribune when she was 9 and told her that a person who didn't read the news was a person who had decided to be surprised by everything. She talked about her father once, early on, just briefly, the way you drop a mention of something and see if the other person picks it up. Mason picked it up. You took over from him? He died 2 years ago, Olivia said, her voice level. He built the company from 3 local radio stations into what it is now. I've been trying to... She paused. I've been trying to not ruin it. Is that how you think about it? Not ruining it. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Everyone is waiting to see if I'm going to fall apart. The board, the shareholders, Derek Holt, who thinks he should have gotten the chair instead of me. She said it without self-pity, just as statement of fact. So yes, some days it feels exactly like that. What did your father think of you? Mason asked. She looked slightly startled by the question. People asked about her father's company. They didn't usually ask about his daughter. He thought I was reckless, she said. He thought I trusted people too fast and felt things too much for the business world. A small, complicated smile. He also thought I was the only one who could run it after him, so maybe both things were true. Olivia looked at him. Yeah, she said quietly. Maybe they were. 5 weeks in, Mason made his first mistake. He mentioned Olivia to Sophie. Not intentionally, not as an announcement. Sophie had asked over dinner why he seemed less tired lately, and Mason had said something like, I've been talking to someone at work. It helps. And Sophie, who was 7 years old and possessed the conversational instincts of a trial lawyer, had immediately wanted to know who, what, where, how old, and did she like animals. She's my boss, Mason said. Your boss, like the most boss. Essentially, yes. Is she nice? Mason considered this. Yes, he said honestly. She's nice. Sophie processed this information with the gravity of a 7-year-old evaluating something potentially important. Does she like elephants? I haven't asked. You should ask, Sophie said, returning to her macaroni with the air of someone who had identified a clear action item. Mason looked at his daughter, her dark eyes, her little frown of concentration, and felt something warm and slightly terrifying move through his chest, because he knew Sophie well enough to know that she had just filed Olivia away in a mental category labeled people to pay attention to, and once Sophie decided to pay attention to someone, that person generally ended up involved in their lives whether they'd planned to be or not. He thought about that later when Sophie was in bed and the apartment was quiet, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside him. He thought about how long it had been since he'd told anyone that a conversation with another person made him feel less tired. He thought about the way Olivia had looked when he'd asked about her father. That particular unguarding that happened sometimes mid-conversation when her guard dropped and the real person showed through, the one that wasn't performing CEO or managing expectations or carrying the weight of a company that used to belong to her father. Then he thought about Derek Holt and the cafeteria and the phones and the fundamental gap between the floor 4 break room and the executive suite and the specific mathematics of his life. Single father, junior tier, monthly rent, his grandfather's upcoming cardiology bills, the small bedroom where Sophie slept surrounded by elephant stuffed animals. And he poured his cold tea down the sink and went to bed. Some things weren't worth thinking about. The variable he hadn't accounted for was his grandfather. Harold Reed was 78, sharp-minded and constitutionally opposed to being told what to do by doctors, which meant his management of the 2 prescriptions he was supposed to be taking had been, at best, inconsistent. Mason had been trying to stay on top of it, leaving pill organizers, calling during lunch breaks, asking his neighbor Mrs. Kowalski to check in twice a week. But Harold was the kind of man who had survived 40 years as a machinist, raised Mason after his parents were gone, and fundamentally believed that the human body was tougher than the medical establishment gave it credit for. He was not entirely wrong about this. He was, however, wrong about the prescriptions. Mason got the call on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon, not from Harold, from the hospital. Harold had been unresponsive when Mrs. Kowalski came by for her afternoon check-in, and the ambulance had taken him to Northwestern Memorial, and someone needed to come. Mason was out of the office and in a cab before he'd fully processed what the nurse had told him. He called Sophie's school and arranged for her to go home with her friend Emma's family. He called Harold's doctor. He sat in the back of the cab watching Chicago traffic crawl past his window and felt the specific cold weight of being the only person to call. Harold was in the ICU by the time Mason arrived. The doctor used the word stroke, and then several other words that Mason heard and processed and immediately lost access to, because his brain had apparently decided that stroke was the only piece of information it could hold right now. He sat in the ICU waiting room for 4 hours. At 9:30 that night, a text appeared on his phone. I heard from HR. I hope he's okay. Let me know if there's anything I can do. Oh, Mason stared at the text for a moment. He's stable. Don't worry about it, he typed back. 3 minutes passed. I'm not worrying about it. I'm asking if you need something. Mason looked up at the fluorescent ceiling of the waiting room, at the vending machine with the flickering light, at the other people scattered in plastic chairs around him. Everyone here with their own wait, their own vigil, their own particular 4 a.m. of the soul. I don't know what I need, he typed. That's an honest answer, she sent back. I'll check in tomorrow. She did. But what happened over the following weeks was not something Mason could have predicted and would not have asked for. Olivia showed up. Not loudly, not in the way of someone performing generosity. She showed up the way a person shows up when they have quietly decided that another person matters and they're not going to make a production about it. She sent food to the hospital waiting room, not catered executive food, just a bag with sandwiches and coffee from the deli down the street, left with the front desk with Mason's name on it. She asked Harold's doctor for a contact number for the specialist his insurance didn't quite cover, and then somehow, through channels Mason couldn't fully trace, that specialist became covered. When Sophie needed to be picked up from school one Thursday because Emma's family had a conflict and Mason was stuck at the hospital, it was Olivia who arranged a car service and then later that evening appeared at the hospital herself with Sophie in tow, his daughter carrying her backpack and her stuffed elephant, looking around the hospital lobby with wide eyes and then spotting Mason in the waiting room and running to him. Mason held his daughter and looked over her head at Olivia, who was standing near the door in her coat, and he didn't know what to say. I brought Elephant, Sophie announced. I see that. Sophie pulled back to look at him. Is Grandpa Harold going to be okay? He's getting better, Mason said, which was true, slowly. The doctors are taking good care of him. Sophie nodded seriously, then turned to look at Olivia. Are you the boss? Olivia glanced at Mason with an expression that was clearly trying not to be amused. I'm a boss, not the only one. My dad says you're nice, Sophie said. Sophie, Mason started. He did say that, Sophie insisted, then turned back to Olivia with complete 7-year-old directness. Do you like elephants? Olivia crouched down to Sophie's level, not performing the gesture, just doing it naturally. I have never spent very much time thinking about elephants, she said. Tell me what I'm missing. Sophie's face lit up with the specific delight of someone who has found an audience that needs educating, and she launched into an accounting of elephant social structure, memory capabilities, and emotional intelligence that she had apparently been assembling from library books for several months. Olivia listened to all of it. She did not check her phone. She did not manage the conversation toward a conclusion. She sat on a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room and listened to a 7-year-old explain why elephants were the most interesting animals on Earth, and her attention was completely real. Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep across 2 chairs with her head on Mason's jacket, and the hospital had quieted into its overnight register, Mason and Olivia sat against the wall with paper cups of vending machine coffee, speaking quietly. "You don't have to keep doing this," Mason said. Olivia looked at her cup. "I know. I mean it. The food, the doctor, tonight. I know you mean it." "Then why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the only person in that building who has ever talked to me like a person." She said it without drama, without asking for a reaction, not like a CEO, not like something to impress or manage or work an angle on. She paused. "You asked me if I liked my job. Nobody has asked me that in 2 years." Mason looked at his daughter, sleeping across the chairs. "That's a sad reason to keep sitting in hospital waiting rooms." "Maybe," Olivia almost smiled. "Or maybe it's a good reason to do things that are actually worth doing." The fluorescent light above the vending machine flickered. Harold's cardiology monitor beeped steadily down the hallway. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep and pulled the stuffed elephant closer. Mason sat with all of it. The weight of the weeks, the exhaustion, the gratitude he didn't know how to hold without it becoming something larger and more complicated than he was ready for. "Thank you," he said finally. Olivia nodded once. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. Outside the hospital windows, Chicago was still and dark, the city lights blurring soft in the late hour, and somewhere down the hall, Mason's grandfather was breathing steadily, and his daughter was dreaming of elephants, and the woman sitting next to him in a plastic chair had come not because she had to, but because she had decided to. That was the part that got him. That was the part he couldn't stop turning over in the days and weeks that followed. Not the money she spent, not the connections she leveraged, not the logistical problems she solved. All of that he could have accepted as the actions of a generous, guilty conscience. What he couldn't explain away was simpler and much harder to dismiss. She stayed. When the waiting rooms were ugly and the hours were long and there was nothing interesting or impressive or advantageous about being there, Olivia Bennett stayed. And Mason Reed, who had spent 4 years learning how to carry the weight of his life completely alone, found himself doing something he hadn't done since a cold November 3 years ago when he'd sat in a different hospital with a different grief. He let someone else sit beside him while he carried it. And he didn't know what to do with the fact that it felt like exactly the right thing. Harold Reed came home from the hospital on a Thursday afternoon in early November, thinner than he'd been and slower on his feet, but with his eyes still sharp and his opinions still fully intact. The doctors had given him a revised medication schedule, a dietary restriction list that Harold had folded into his shirt pocket with the careful deliberateness of a man who intended to lose it, and a strong recommendation that he not live alone for the foreseeable future. That last point had kept Mason up for 3 nights in a row. The apartment he rented in Wicker Park was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator. Sophie had the 2nd bedroom. Mason slept on a pull-out couch when his grandfather visited, which had been manageable for weekend stays but was not a sustainable arrangement for indefinite recovery. He'd started running numbers, which was, professionally speaking, what Mason did best, and the numbers were not cooperating. A larger apartment in a building with an elevator, in a neighborhood close enough to Sophie's school and Harold's cardiology follow-ups, ran about $400 more per month than Mason currently paid. He had 3 months of emergency savings that he'd been refusing to touch since his wife died, kept in a separate account like a talisman, like proof that he'd prepared for at least some of the things life could throw at him. He transferred the money on a Tuesday and signed a new lease on a Wednesday, and by the following weekend he was moving Harold's single piece of significant furniture, a recliner that weighed approximately as much as a small car, and that Harold referred to as the chair with a reverence usually reserved for family heirlooms, up a flight of stairs with the help of Tyler from work, who complained about his back the entire time but showed up anyway, which was the Tyler Reed had come to expect and appreciate. "This chair is going to kill me," Tyler announced from the bottom of the stairs. "It's not going to kill you," Mason said from the top. "My chiropractor is going to kill me after this chair almost kills me." "Tyler, I'm just saying there are multiple steps in the process. Lift." They got the chair up. Harold settled into it that evening with the contentment of a man restored to his rightful place, looked around the new apartment and said, "It smells like fresh paint and other people's choices." "Thank you, Grandpa," Mason said. "I'm not complaining. I'm observing." Harold looked at him over his reading glasses. "You didn't have to do this. You couldn't do the stairs at the old place." "I could have managed." "You were in the ICU 3 weeks ago." Harold made a sound that was not agreement but was not disagreement either. The particular sound of a man who knew he'd lost an argument and was declining to formally concede. He picked up the remote control and turned on the evening news, which meant the conversation was over, which was fine with Mason because he didn't have anything else to add to it. He went to the kitchen and stood at the sink running water that he didn't need, looking at the unfamiliar street below the window, and did the quiet accounting of the decision he'd just made. Emergency savings gone. New rent. Harold's follow-up appointments 3 times a month, 2 of which the insurance didn't fully cover. Sophie's winter coat needed replacing. She'd grown 2 inches since last year. It was manageable. It was always manageable. Mason had become, over the years, very good at making things manageable. What he hadn't told Harold, what he hadn't told anyone, was that he'd been passed over for a promotion 6 weeks ago. A junior to mid-level bump that would have meant an extra $8,000 a year. He'd found out through Tyler, who had found out through HR gossip, which meant the news had traveled the building before it reached the person it directly affected, which Mason had filed away as information about how Hartwell Media operated rather than something worth getting emotional about. The promotion had gone to someone named Greg Hansen, who had been with the company 11 months longer and who laughed very loudly at Derek Holt's jokes at every company meeting. Mason was not drawing a direct connection between these 2 facts. He was simply noting their coexistence. He turned off the tap, dried his hands, and went to help Sophie set up her side of the new bedroom. She had an opinion about where everything should go, and that opinion was thorough and detailed and bore no relationship to logic or spatial reasoning, and Mason moved her bookshelf 3 times before she was satisfied. And by the time they were done, it was past 9, and he was tired in the particular deep way of someone who had been running on empty for long enough that empty had started to feel normal. Sophie climbed into her bed. New room, same elephant, same small ritual of tucking the stuffed animal precisely under one arm before she'd lie still, and looked at Mason with her mother's eyes. "Is Olivia going to visit?" she asked. Mason blinked. "What?" "She came to the hospital. Is she going to visit here?" "She's my coworker, Soph. She sat with me for an hour and told me elephants were fascinating and then looked up 3 facts on her phone to add to what I already knew," Sophie said, with the precision of a child cataloging evidence. "That's not a coworker thing. It's complicated." Sophie considered this. Emma's mom says adults say it's complicated when they don't want to explain something. Emma's mom is not wrong. So explain it. Go to sleep, Sophie. She gave him a look that suggested this conversation was tabled rather than finished, which, with Sophie, was always the case. Mason kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and stood in the narrow hallway of the new apartment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the building settling around him. Different pipes, different traffic patterns through the windows, Harold's news program murmuring from the living room. His phone buzzed. How did the move go? Oh. He stood in the hallway a moment before answering. Harold lost the medication list the doctor gave him within 4 hours, so pretty much as expected. 3 dots appeared, then, I'm shocked. Completely shocked. He also immediately started complaining about the street noise, even though it's quieter than his old place. Classic Harold behavior from everything you've described. Mason almost smiled. Sophie asked if you were going to visit. A longer pause this time. What did you tell her? That it was complicated. What did she say? That adults say that when they don't want to explain something. Another pause. Then, your daughter is going to be terrifying when she's 40. She's already terrifying at 7. He could almost hear Olivia laughing, that real laugh she had, the one that was slightly undignified and came out when she wasn't managing her image, which happened more often in their break room conversations and text exchanges than it probably did anywhere else in her life. Get some sleep, she sent. You've been running on nothing for weeks. He had been. She wasn't wrong. You too, he typed back. He plugged in his phone, listened to Harold turn off the news, listened to the new apartment breathe around his family, and lay on his pull-out couch in the living room staring at the ceiling for a long time before sleep came. He was not thinking about the promotion he didn't get. He was not running the numbers on the emergency savings or the rent or Sophie's winter coat. He was thinking about a woman sitting in a hospital chair listening to his daughter explain elephant social structure with her phone put away and her full attention given freely, and the way that image kept returning to him at the exact moments when he was most determined not to let it. Some things weren't worth thinking about. He was getting worse at believing that. The promotion situation, as it turned out, didn't stay quiet. About 2 weeks after Harold came home, Mason was reviewing third-quarter expense reports when he got a calendar invitation from Priya Summers, Olivia's head of partnerships, requesting a 30-minute meeting. No subject line, just his name, her name, a conference room on floor 6, and a time slot the following morning. He accepted it without mentioning it to Olivia. He didn't think it was related to her, and he also didn't think it was appropriate to run every professional development through the filter of their friendship, which was already complicated enough without him treating her like a professional resource. Priya Summers was the kind of person who was always slightly more interested in you than seemed warranted, which Mason had initially read as warmth but had gradually come to understand as a very specific form of information gathering. She had dark eyes that moved quickly, a smile that appeared and disappeared with surgical efficiency, and a reputation in the building for knowing things before they became officially knowable. She had 2 cups of coffee waiting when Mason arrived. Good coffee. Floor 8 coffee. That told him something. "Mason," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her, "thanks for making time." "Sure," he sat. "What's this about?" No small talk with Priya. She appreciated directness, which was one of the things Mason actually liked about her. "I want to talk to you about the mid-level analyst position." Mason kept his expression even. "The one that went to Greg Hansen." "The one that went to Greg Hansen," Priya confirmed. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "That decision was made by Derek, not by Olivia." "Derek doesn't make hiring decisions above Tier 3, Mason said. "Officially, no." Priya looked at him steadily. "Derek has a great deal of informal influence over decisions that are officially made by other people. That's a political reality of this company that predates Olivia's tenure and that she's been working to address." A pause. Slowly, Mason processed this. "Why are you telling me?" "Because there's a second position opening in January, a real one, mid-level financial strategy division, reporting directly to CFO rather than through the analyst pool." She slid a folder across the table. "The application window opens December 1st. I'm telling you because I think you should apply, and I'm telling you before the general announcement because I want you to have time to prepare a strong submission." Mason looked at the folder. "Why does Priya Summers care whether I apply for a position in financial strategy?" She considered him for a moment. "Because I pay attention to who does good work in this building," she said carefully, "and I think Derek's influence has meant some good work has gone unrecognized." Another pause, more deliberate this time. "That's the official answer." "What's the unofficial one?" She picked up her coffee. "I like Olivia. I think she's the best thing that's happened to this company in a long time, and I think the people around her matter." She met his eyes. "That's all I'm going to say about that." Mason sat with that for a moment. "Does Olivia know you're talking to me?" "No?" Priya said it cleanly, without apology. "And I'd prefer it stayed that way. She has enough to manage without feeling like her friends are being handled." The word friends landed in the space between them, and neither of them addressed it directly. Mason picked up the folder. December 1st. "December 1st, Priya confirmed. "Be thorough. Derek will be looking for reasons to dismiss it." He took the folder home that evening and read through it at the kitchen table while Harold watched television in the other room and Sophie finished a school project about migratory birds. The position was a genuine step up, not just in salary, but in scope, in visibility, in the kind of work that actually used the parts of his brain he'd spent 7 years training. He knew he was qualified. He'd known honestly that he was qualified for the position that had gone to Greg Hansen, and the knowledge of that had been sitting in him like a small, unresolved irritant for weeks. He set the folder on the table and looked at it. "What's that?" Sophie asked from across the table. "A job application." She looked at him over her bird migration diagram. "Are you going to apply?" "I'm thinking about it." "What's to think about?" Mason looked at his daughter. "It's more complicated than it looks." "You say that a lot," Sophie said. "A lot of things are complicated." "Emma's mom says—" "I know what Emma's mom says, Soph." Sophie returned to her birds, but there was a satisfaction in her posture that suggested she felt her point had landed adequately. Mason looked at the folder again and thought about Priya's careful, deliberate phrasing. The people around her matter. He turned that over in his mind, looking at it from different angles, trying to determine whether it changed anything about the situation or just made the situation clearer. He applied on December 2nd, one day after the window opened, not the first day because he wanted to make sure the application was right rather than just fast. He spent 4 evenings working on it after Sophie was in bed, Harold having gone to sleep early in the way older people did after illness, the apartment quiet around him. He wrote 3 drafts. He was precise about his numbers, specific about his recommendations, and he said nothing in it about anything that had happened in the cafeteria or the 4th floor break room or hospital waiting room in November. He submitted it at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday and then sat at the kitchen table for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the confirmation email on his screen. Then he closed his laptop and went to sleep. And in the morning, he made Sophie's lunch and drove Harold to his cardiology follow-up and went to work. And he didn't tell Olivia about any of it, which turned out to be a decision that didn't survive the week. She found out on Friday. He was in the 4th floor break room when she appeared, which was normal enough, but her expression when she walked in was different from the usual, something moving behind her eyes that wasn't quite the comfortable register of their break room conversations. She poured her coffee and sat down across from him and said, "You applied for the financial strategy position." It wasn't a question. Mason looked at her. "How did you find out?" "I'm the CEO. Applications come through systems I have access to." "Did you pull my application specifically?" A pause. "No. It was flagged in a review I was already doing." She looked at him carefully. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's a job application, not a conversation topic." "Mason. Olivia." He held her gaze. "I applied for a position I'm qualified for through the standard process. There's nothing to tell. Derek is going to see it. I know. He already doesn't like you." "I know that too." She put her cup down with slightly more force than necessary. "Why are you being stubborn about this?" "Because I don't want a job because I know you," Mason said, directly and without particular heat. "I want it because I'm good at the work. If those 2 things become confused in any way, including in my own head, then the whole thing is worth less." He looked at her. "You understand that?" She did. He could see it. She understood it precisely, which was exactly why it frustrated her, because she could see the logic and still feel the frustration of being excluded from something that affected him. "Derek is going to find a way to block it," she said. "Maybe. That doesn't bother you?" "It bothers me. It doesn't change what the right process is." Olivia was quiet for a moment. She picked up her cup again, turned it in her hands, a gesture Mason had come to recognize as her equivalent of counting to 10. "I can't interfere directly," she said finally. "I want to be clear that I'm not going to do that." "I know. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't care how it comes out." "That's fine," Mason said. "I don't expect you not to care." She looked at him with an expression that was complicated in ways neither of them was going to name out loud in the 4th floor break room on a Friday morning. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Mason said. They drank their bad coffee and talked about a city planning article she'd read that morning, and by the time they both went back to work, the conversation about the application was functionally closed, folded away into the part of their friendship where the things that mattered most were acknowledged briefly and then respected with silence. December moved fast, the way Chicago Decembers did, the cold arriving with serious intent, Lake Michigan generating the particular gray sky pressure that made the whole city feel slightly compressed, the holiday decorations on Michigan Avenue doing their best against the wind. Mason's relationship with Olivia outside of work hours had remained carefully undefined, which was a choice they were both making without discussing the fact that they were making it. They texted most evenings, never about anything urgent, usually about something one of them had read or something Harold had done or something Sophie had said that was either hilarious or alarming, depending on your perspective. On 2 Saturdays in November, they had ended up at the same farmer's market near Olivia's apartment building entirely by accident the first time, and by a coincidence that required some coordination the second time, though neither of them pointed this out. What they hadn't done was anything that could be clearly classified as a date. Mason was aware of this. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a door you've been walking past for months without opening, conscious of its presence, its shape, its weight, without being ready to reach for the handle. The reasons were various and real and honest. The promotion situation made the professional dimension of their relationship actively fraught. Harold's recovery required attention. Sophie was at an age where she was perceptive enough to read changes in her father's emotional weather, and Mason was careful about what he brought into her orbit. And underneath all of that was the simpler, harder thing, that loving someone after loss was not something Mason had a clean framework for. He'd loved his wife, he'd lost her. He'd built a life inside the aftermath of that, carefully, deliberately, and he didn't know how to integrate something new into that structure without feeling like he was somehow dismantling something he'd worked very hard to hold together. He hadn't said any of this to Olivia. He suspected she understood some of it anyway. What he hadn't anticipated was Olivia having her own version of the same fear. He found out about it the way he found out about most things that mattered, indirectly, in a break room, over coffee that hadn't gotten any better despite being a month into whatever it was they were. She'd had a board meeting that morning. He could tell before she sat down. There was a specific quality of tension she carried out of board meetings, a tightness around her jaw that she was usually good at concealing, but that showed up when she was genuinely rattled rather than just professionally pressured. "Bad meeting?" he asked. "Standard meeting," she said. "You're holding your cup with both hands." She looked down at her cup, relaxed her grip slightly. Raymond Holt, Derek's father, one of our largest shareholders, raised the question of leadership optics. She said it flatly. Specifically, whether I was maintaining the appropriate professional image for a CEO. Mason was quiet for a moment. "This is about the cafeteria." "This is about everything since the cafeteria." Olivia's voice stayed level, but something underneath it wasn't. Someone gave Raymond a summary: the cafeteria, the hospital visits, the farmer's market. She paused. Apparently someone with a long lens took a photograph. The cold weight of that settled over Mason. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. You haven't done anything." "I know. I'm still sorry this is happening to you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the CEO armor set aside for a moment. Raymond's implication was that I was making myself vulnerable, that I was... She stopped. That I was getting involved with someone below my station. The phrase landed between them with a particular ugliness. Below my station. Mason registered it the way you registered a cold gust, physically, briefly, before the moment passed. "What did you say?" he asked. "I said my personal life was not a board agenda item." She looked at her coffee. "And then I spent the rest of the meeting wondering if he was right." "About which part?" "About whether I'm being careless." She said it carefully, the way someone says something they've been turning over in private for long enough that it's worn smooth. "About whether I'm letting something personal cloud judgment that I need to keep clear." Mason looked at her steadily. "Do you think you are?" "I think..." She stopped. "I think I've been very careful my whole professional life. I think I've made every decision with the company's stability as the primary metric. I think I have never once put something I wanted above something that was strategically sound." She turned the cup in her hands. "And I think I'm sitting in this break room twice a week drinking terrible coffee because I want to, not because it's strategic, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with that." The break room was quiet around them. Someone's microwave beeped down the hall. Chicago traffic murmured through the windows. "Raymond Holt's problem," Mason said, "is not that you're being careless. His problem is that he expected to have a different kind of influence over you, and he doesn't." He kept his voice even. "And Derek's problem is the same thing in a different shape. They both want you to make decisions inside a structure that benefits them. That's not a leadership optics issue. That's a power issue." Olivia looked at him. "You know this," Mason said. "You've known it. Knowing it doesn't make the board meeting easier." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the December sky pressed flat and gray over the city. "My father used to say that the loneliest part of leadership was that the people who were supposed to support you were often the same people most interested in your limitations." She said it softly, without quite looking at him. "I thought I understood what he meant when I took the job. And now I understand it more completely." Mason did not say what he was thinking. He was thinking that she was describing the specific loneliness of a person who had been moving very fast, very competently, for a very long time, and who had not allowed herself to stop and feel how tired she was because stopping meant acknowledging how much weight she'd been carrying alone. He was thinking that he recognized that particular loneliness because he had been living inside a version of it for 4 years. He did not say any of this. Some things didn't need to be named to be understood. The application outcome comes back in 3 weeks, he said instead, redirecting them both towards something with a definite timeline and manageable parameters. Olivia accepted the redirect. Are you nervous? About Derek's interference or about my own performance? Both. Yes to both. He picked up his cup. But the work is good. The application is honest. Whatever happens to it from there is outside my control. She considered him with something in her expression that he'd seen before. That particular way she had of looking at him when she was thinking something she wasn't ready to say. What? He asked. Nothing, she said. I'm just... She stopped, shook her head slightly. Nothing. He let it go. But that evening, walking home from the train station in the cold, collar up against the wind off the lake, he turned over the way she'd looked at him in that moment, the unfinished sentence, the slight shake of her head. And he thought about Sophie's question and Priya's careful phrasing and the farmer's market and the hospital waiting room. And he thought about the door he'd been walking past for months. He thought about it all the way home. He stood outside his building for a moment in the cold, the wind moving through the street, the light from the third-floor window showing Harold's television moving behind the curtain. Somewhere up there, Sophie was probably done with homework and negotiating with Harold about how late she could stay up. Mason stood on the sidewalk in the dark and let himself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what he'd been carefully not acknowledging for 2 months. Then he went inside because Harold needed his evening medication and Sophie needed to go to bed, and the feeling didn't go anywhere. It stayed with him, settled in the way things settled when they were true. But he carried it quietly, the way he'd learned to carry most things. Some doors you approach slowly. But he was closer to the handle than he'd been before. And some part of him, the part that had stood up in a cafeteria on a Tuesday afternoon and crossed a room when everything in him said to stay seated, that part knew what that meant. The application result came back on a Wednesday, which Mason always remembered later as the kind of specific detail that lodges in memory for no rational reason. Not a Monday, not a Friday, but a Wednesday, the middle of a week in the middle of a Chicago December that had committed fully to being miserable. He got the email at 8:47 a.m. He read it twice, standing at his desk with his coat still on, and then he sat down, and then he read it a third time because the first two hadn't fully resolved into meaning. The position had been filled internally. The successful candidate was a mid-level manager from the partnerships division named Scott Ellery, who had been with the company for 4 years, and who, as far as Mason could determine from professional observation, was perfectly competent and also happened to be Derek Holt's former college roommate, a fact that was available to anyone who'd spent 20 minutes on LinkedIn. Mason set his phone face down on the desk. He put his hands flat on the surface, the same gesture he'd made after submitting the application, but the feeling underneath it was entirely different. Then he picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, drank it anyway, and opened his morning reports. Tyler appeared at the edge of his cubicle 20 minutes later. I heard, Tyler said. Word travels fast. Scott Ellery told people at the coffee machine he seemed happy about it. Tyler leaned against the partition. For what it's worth, I looked at his credentials. You were more qualified. I know, Mason said. That's messed up, right? That's objectively messed up. Yes, Mason said. It is. He kept his eyes on the screen. Go back to work, Tyler. Tyler went. Mason worked. He was good at working through things. It was one of the skills he'd developed over the years of carrying everything quietly. The ability to put his hands on a task and let the motion of it contain him while everything else processed at a different level, slower, beneath the surface. What processed at that different level, slowly, over the course of the morning, was something that surprised him with its clarity. He wasn't devastated. He was angry. A clean, cold anger. Not dramatic, just honest. And underneath the anger was something that had been forming for a while without his quite acknowledging it. A decision. He was going to leave Hartwell Media Group. Not today. Not in a way that burned anything down. But he was going to start looking, quietly and seriously, for something else. Because Derek Holt's shadow over this company was a structural problem that was not going to resolve itself on Mason's timeline. And Mason had a daughter and a grandfather and a new lease and exactly 0 emergency savings, and the patient strategy of being good at his work inside a building Where goodness at work was not the primary metric for advancement was costing him money. He didn't have to spare. He had reached this conclusion by 10:15 and felt, in a way that was slightly startling, better. Having a plan helped. It always had. He did not go to the fourth-floor break room that day at the time when Olivia sometimes appeared. He also did not text her. This was not a calculated decision. It was just that he needed to process what had happened inside his own mind before he processed it in front of anyone else. And Olivia was too perceptive and too present in his thinking for him to maintain any useful distance around her when he was in the middle of something. She texted him at 4 p.m. "I know about Scott Ellery. Are you okay?" He looked at the message for a long moment. "I'm fine. Talk later?" Of course. He picked up Sophie from her after-school program, stopped at the grocery store, made dinner, helped with homework, sat with Harold while Harold watched a documentary about World War II naval battles, and offered tactical commentary that may or may not have been historically accurate. And by 8:30, the apartment was quiet, and Mason was at the kitchen table with his laptop open to a job search website he hadn't visited in almost 3 years. He stared at it for a while without typing anything. Then his phone rang. Actual ring, not text, which was unusual enough that he picked up without looking at the screen. "You're not fine," Olivia said. "I said I was fine. You didn't come to the break room and you gave me a 3-word text response. For you, that's the equivalent of someone else lying on the floor." A pause. "What happened after you got the email?" Mason leaned back in his chair. "I decided to start looking for another job." A silence. "Okay," she said carefully. "Not immediately, not dramatically, but Derek is not going away, and his father has Raymond's ear on the board, and I have—" He stopped. "I have too many real obligations to keep waiting for a structural problem to fix itself." "That's a reasonable conclusion," Olivia said. He could hear something restrained in her voice. "Say the thing you're not saying." Another pause. "I don't want you to leave," she said. "That's not a professional opinion. It's a personal one, and it probably shouldn't factor into your decision, and I know that." A beat. "But I'm saying it because not saying it would be dishonest." Mason sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its nighttime thing. The ambient glow, the sirens at intervals, the wind through the gap in the building across the street that always made a particular whistling sound around this hour. "It factors in," he said. "I'm not pretending it doesn't." But Sophie's winter coat was $40 I didn't really have, and Harold's next specialist appointment isn't covered, and I've been passed over twice for positions I was more qualified for than the people who got them. He kept his voice even. "I have to make decisions based on what's actually true." "I know," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere tomorrow. I'm just looking." "Okay." She was quiet for a beat. "Mason." "Yeah, I'm sorry about the promotion. Both of them." A pause. "What Derek is doing is wrong. I want you to know that I see it, even if I haven't been able to stop it as fast as it needed to be stopped. It's not your fault. It's my company." He didn't have a clean answer to that. "I know," he said. They talked for another 40 minutes. Not about Derek, not about the job, just about the things they talked about in break rooms and over text. Harold's continuing resistance to dietary modifications, Sophie's upcoming school winter pageant in which she was playing a migratory bird and had very strong feelings about the accuracy of her costume, a building on the near north side that had just been announced for demolition despite a community preservation effort that Olivia had been quietly following for months. When Mason finally hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen, he recognized the particular feeling of the conversation, that ease, that specific quality of being heard and of hearing someone back. And he sat with it honestly this time, instead of trying to categorize it. He was in love with her. He'd known it for weeks, in the way you sometimes know things before you let yourself say them clearly. The hospital hallway, the farmer's market, the break room, the late text exchanges. The way she'd sat on the floor next to Sophie and listened about elephants with her phone in her pocket. All of it had been accumulating toward a conclusion that he'd been approaching obliquely, the way you approach something that contains a real amount of risk. He let himself feel it fully for exactly 1 minute, sitting alone in the kitchen at 9:30 at night. Then he closed the job search website, opened a new spreadsheet to track Harold's medication schedule, and went to bed. The school winter pageant happened on a Friday evening in mid-December in the gymnasium of Sophie's elementary school. which smelled of industrial cleaner and construction paper, and the massed presence of 200 families who had all made the same decision to sit in folding metal chairs for 90 minutes in the name of parental love. Sophie was playing the Arctic tern, a species she had selected herself based on what she described as its objectively impressive migratory range. And she had spent the better part of 2 weeks educating everyone in the apartment about this choice. Harold now knew more about Arctic terns than he had ever wanted to know, and had expressed this view several times. Mason had helped construct a pair of wings from craft foam and white fabric that were, in Sophie's assessment, scientifically accurate enough. Mason arrived early to get seats, which was also when he discovered that Sophie had, apparently without mentioning it, told Olivia about the pageant. He was unfolding 2 chairs in the 3rd row when he heard Sophie's voice from across the gymnasium, the particular elevated frequency of a child who has spotted someone they're pleased about. And he turned to see his daughter pulling Olivia through the gymnasium door by the hand with the cheerful authority of someone who has decided a thing is happening and is implementing it. Olivia was wearing a normal coat, not the burgundy blazer, not the CEO wardrobe. Dark coat, jeans, a scarf. She was in the process of unwinding with her free hand while Sophie towed her forward. She looked, for the first time Mason could clearly remember, like a person who had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. She caught his eye over Sophie's head. Her expression was equal parts apology and something else. Something that was almost shy, which was not a quality Mason had previously associated with Olivia Bennett. "She invited me," Olivia said when Sophie had released her and gone sprinting toward a cluster of classmates. "3 weeks ago. I should have told you." "You should have, Meg," Mason agreed. "I didn't want you to tell me not to come." He looked at her for a long moment. "I wasn't going to tell you not to come." "You might have." "Olivia." "I know." She sat in the chair Sophie had apparently designated for her, which was next to Mason's. "I know." They sat in the folding metal chairs in the gymnasium of a Chicago elementary school while 200 families settled around them, and neither of them said anything particularly significant, which felt, somehow, exactly right. The pageant itself was exactly what school pageants always were: slightly chaotic, intermittently audible, lit by someone who had done their best with gymnasium fluorescence, featuring one child who clearly had significant stage presence and several others who were primarily focused on finding their parents in the audience. Sophie, it turned out, was the child with significant stage presence. She delivered her lines about the Arctic tern's 44,000-mile annual migration with a conviction that suggested she took the material seriously and expected the audience to do the same. Mason watched his daughter from the 3rd row of folding chairs. Beside him, Olivia was completely still, not checking her phone, not scanning the room, watching Sophie with the same full attention she'd given the elephant explanation in the hospital waiting room. Afterward, when Sophie came tearing out of the gymnasium still wearing her wings, she threw herself at Mason first, and then immediately turned to Olivia and said, "Did you know about the Antarctic feeding grounds? I almost put it in, but Mr. Garber said it was too much for the script." "That seems like a mistake on his part," Olivia said seriously. "That's what I told him," Sophie said. Mason watched the 2 of them and felt the thing in his chest that had no clean name, large and complicated and real, full of everything he couldn't organize into a manageable structure. Sophie grabbed both their hands and pulled them toward the refreshment table, which turned out to have decent cookies, and the 3 of them stood in a school gymnasium surrounded by families and ate sugar cookies in the shapes of snowflakes, while Sophie debriefed her performance with the intensity of a director reviewing dailies. It was the most normal evening Mason had experienced in years. That was the thing that stayed with him later. Not that it was glamorous or significant or cinematic, just that it was normal, in the way that normal had felt out of reach for a very long time. The 3 of them in a noisy gymnasium, cookies going stale on a paper plate, Sophie describing the precise angle at which an Arctic tern banks into a headwind, Olivia listening with full attention. He drove home with Sophie asleep in the back seat and the city moving past the windows, and he thought about the door again. He thought he might be ready to reach for the handle. The problem arrived the following week, from a direction Mason hadn't anticipated. He was in Harold's room on Sunday afternoon, helping him sort through a box of old papers that had come from the storage unit Harold kept near his old apartment. The kind of archaeological task that old men periodically required help with, and that involved equal parts nostalgia and confusion about what was worth keeping. Harold was in his chair directing. Mason was on the floor going through folders. "That pile is important," Harold said, pointing. "That pile is garbage. The middle pile I haven't decided." The middle pile is mostly grocery circulars from 2019, Mason said. Those might be useful. They're not, Grandpa. Harold made his sound of non-conceding agreement. Then, after a moment, the Bennett girl came to the pageant. Mason continued sorting. Her name is Olivia. I know her name? Harold paused. Sophie told me about it, in some detail. Sophie tells everyone everything in some detail. She said Olivia held her hand during the scary part. Mason looked up. There was a scary part? Apparently one of the third graders had a very alarming owl costume. Harold watched his grandson with the particular attentiveness of a man who had raised him and knew his face very well. How serious is this? Mason turned back to the folder in his hands. It's not... We haven't... That's not what I asked. Mason was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Yes, you do, Harold said, not unkindly. You've known for a while. I can tell because you've stopped mentioning her casually, which means you've started being careful about it. Mason set the folder down and looked at his grandfather. Harold was thinner than he'd been before the stroke, which had changed his face in a way Mason was still adjusting to. The same eyes, the same jaw, but the geography slightly rearranged. Older, more plainly fragile than he'd ever allowed himself to seem before. She's my boss, Mason said. Technically, she's your boss's boss, Harold said. I looked up the org chart. You looked up? I had time in the hospital. Harold shrugged, unapologetic. She runs a billion-dollar company, and she sat in a plastic hospital chair for 3 hours. That's not nothing. I know it's not nothing. Then what's the problem? Mason sat with the question for a moment, the box of papers between them, the Sunday light coming flat through the window. The problem is that she lives in a completely different world. Professionally, financially, publicly. If something goes wrong between us, it affects her reputation, my job, Sophie's stability. He stopped. I've spent 4 years building something that works for this family. It's not glamorous, but it works. And if I reach for something outside of it and it falls apart, I don't have a margin for that. Sorry. Harold was quiet, looking at him. And, Mason said, because his grandfather was still looking at him in that way. Because the last time I loved someone and built something with them, I lost her. And I don't... He stopped again. I don't know how to want something that much and also accept that it might go. The room was quiet. The Sunday city sounds moved through the window. A car, someone's radio, the wind. Your grandmother and I were together for 41 years, Harold said finally, and every single one of those years I knew she could leave me, or I could lose her, or something could take it all apart. That's just true. That's always true. He looked at his grandson steadily. The question is never whether the risk is real. It's whether you're willing to be a person who lives small enough to avoid it. Mason looked at his grandfather. I'm not saying fall off a cliff, Harold said. I'm saying stop standing 20 feet back from the edge like there's nothing worth seeing. Mason picked up a folder from the box, looked at it, put it in the garbage pile. That was important, Harold said. It was a Sears catalog from 2017. Sentimental value. There's no such thing as sentimental value for a Sears catalog. Harold muttered something and Mason kept sorting, and neither of them said anything else about Olivia for the rest of the afternoon, but the conversation stayed with him the way his grandfather's best observations always did, quietly, lodged somewhere useful. The week before Christmas, Derek Holt made his most direct move yet. Mason found out about it the way he found out about most things at Hartwell, from Tyler, who had a gift for being in the right hallway at the right moment. Derek had requested a formal review of Mason's performance metrics, citing irregularities in expense report submissions. The irregularities, when Mason pulled his own records, consisted of 2 minor formatting inconsistencies from 8 months ago that had been approved through normal channels. It was not, by any professional standard, grounds for a formal review. What it was, recognizably, was a paper trail. Mason stared at the documentation and felt the cold anger again. The same clean, clear anger from the morning of the Scott Ellery email. He spent an hour pulling every record he had, organizing it into a format that would have been comprehensible to a hostile audience, and then he forwarded it to HR with a note that was professional and precise and contained no emotional language whatsoever. Then he opened his job search website and spent 45 minutes actually using it. He had 3 responses by the following morning, which told him something about the labor market for his skill set that was, professionally speaking, useful to know. He was deep in one of the response emails when Olivia appeared at his cubicle. Not in the break room, not after hours, at his actual desk, on the actual floor, at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, which was unusual enough that Tyler actually stopped pretending not to watch. "My office," Olivia said quietly, "when you have a moment." Her expression was controlled in the way it got when she was managing something difficult. Not cold. She was never cold with him, but careful. Mason followed her to the elevator without saying anything to Tyler, who was definitely going to have opinions about this later. Upstairs, in the office with the city view and the paper-covered desk, Olivia didn't sit. She stood at the window with her arms folded, which was how she stood when she was angry and trying to be measured about it. "Derek requested the performance review yesterday afternoon," she said. "I know. I already submitted the documentation to HR." She turned. Everything's in order. The formatting issues were approved by my direct supervisor at the time. There's no basis for the review." He held her gaze. "He's trying to build a file. I didn't give him anything to put in it." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "I can stop this." "I know you can. But you don't want me to. I want you to do what you think is right for the company," Mason said carefully. "Not what protects me specifically. If you start making executive decisions to shield one employee from Derek's interference, he uses that against you, against both of us. I'm aware of that." "Then you know why I'm not asking you to do anything." She turned back to the window. "Raymond Holt is coming to the company Christmas party next week. Derek invited him. Raymond almost never comes to company events." A pause. "I don't think that's a coincidence." Mason stood in the middle of the office and looked at Olivia's back, the set of her shoulders, the particular tension she carried when she was calculating something with insufficient data. He thought about what Harold had said about living small enough to avoid risk. He thought about the door. "Olivia," he said. She turned. "Are you afraid of what Raymond is going to do? Or are you afraid of what you're going to do if Raymond pushes hard enough?" She looked at him with an expression that was completely unguarded for just a moment, raw in a way that the lobby photographs had never shown, in a way that the executive floor rarely saw. "Both," she said. The word landed in the room with the weight of something honest. "What would you do?" Mason asked. "If Raymond pushed hard enough. What's the version of this where you make the safe choice?" She held his gaze. "I pull back," she said quietly. "I put distance between us. I become professional and appropriate, and I stop going to the 4th floor break room, and I stop texting about Arctic terns, and I manage this into something that Raymond can't photograph or use." "And is that what you want to do?" A long silence. Chicago sat outside the window, gray and cold and enormous. "No," Olivia said. "Then we have something to figure out," Mason said. She looked at him for a long time. "I've never been good at the part where you just let something be real," she said. "My father told me I felt things too much. My board acts like my emotional life is a liability. I've spent 2 years in this job treating everything personal as a problem to be managed." She paused. "You don't manage." "I'm not a problem," Mason said. "I know." Something moved across her face. "That's what I don't know what to do with." The office was very quiet. Outside, the city moved through its Thursday morning, indifferent and enormous. "I'm going to be at the party," Mason said finally, "and I'm not going to hide in a corner. And whatever Raymond Holt or Derek Holt or anyone else does with that information is outside my control." He kept his voice steady. "I'm done making myself small so that other people are comfortable with the space I take up." Olivia looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, she smiled. Not the CEO smile, not the performed warmth. The real one, slightly crooked, slightly surprised. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay," Mason said, and meant it. He took the elevator back to the 4th floor and sat at his desk and thought about what he'd just said, turning it over, testing its weight. It held. Tyler appeared at the edge of the cubicle within 4 minutes. "So," Tyler said. "Not now, Tyler." "Just, not now, Tyler." Tyler retreated. Mason returned to his screen, and outside the windows of the 4th floor Chicago was getting dark by 4 in the afternoon, the way it did in December. The Christmas lights on Michigan Avenue already lit against the early dark, the city wrapped in its winter version of itself. He texted Sophie to say he'd be late picking her up, that Mrs. Kowalski would get her from school, and Sophie texted back a string of elephant emojis that he had come to understand as her general endorsement of his life choices, which was the Sophie version of support and which Mason appreciated more than he could reasonably explain. He sat at his desk until 6, finishing the work that actually needed finishing, and then he put on his coat and took the elevator down to the lobby. And as he pushed through the revolving door into the cold Chicago street, he had the specific, clarifying feeling of a person who has spent a long time being careful and has finally decided, deliberately and with full information, to be something else. The Christmas party was in 7 days. Raymond Holt would be there. Derek Holt would be there. Olivia Bennett would be there. And Mason Reed was going to stand in that room and take up the space he was entitled to take up, and whatever came from that was going to be what it was. He walked to the train station with his hands in his pockets, and the wind off the lake pushing at his back, and the city lights blurred gold in the cold air around him, and for the first time in a long time he was not afraid of what was coming. He was, cautiously and honestly, something closer to ready. The Hartwell Media Group annual Christmas party was held on the 42nd floor of a building on Walker Drive that had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides and a view of the Chicago River that, on a clear winter night, made the city look like something that had been designed specifically to be impressive. The event planning team had done what event planning teams always did with a generous budget and an executive mandate. Everything looked expensive, nothing looked comfortable, and the bar was open. Mason arrived at 7:15 in a dark suit he'd bought 3 years ago for a work conference and had worn twice since. It still fit. He'd checked in the bathroom mirror at home, while Sophie watched from the doorway with the evaluating expression she'd developed recently, the one that meant she was forming an opinion she would definitely share. "You look nice," she'd said. "Thank you." "Olivia will think so too." Sophie. "I'm just observing," she said, with Harold's exact inflection, which meant the two of them had been spending too much time together and had begun to merge. Mason had kissed her forehead, told Harold where the emergency numbers were, a ritual Harold found mildly insulting, and Mason performed anyway, and taken a cab to Wacker Drive. The elevator opened onto noise and light and the particular social pressure of a company party, which was the specific purgatory of being required to be pleasant to people you spent 11 months successfully avoiding. Mason took a glass of something from a passing tray, sparkling water. He wasn't drinking tonight. He wanted to be clear-headed, and moved through the room with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided in advance not to be unnerved by any of it. He saw Derek Holt immediately. Derek was near the window with a cluster of mid-level managers, already loud, already operating at the frequency of a man who felt very comfortable in a room. He saw Mason, and there was a beat, brief, almost invisible, of something calculating moving through his expression before he turned back to his audience and laughed at something someone said. Mason noted it and moved on. He saw Priya Summers near the bar, talking to 2 people from legal. She caught his eye over their shoulders and gave him a small, precise nod that conveyed several things without conveying anything specifically. Mason nodded back. He did not immediately see Olivia. He found a position near the windows on the north side, where the river lay below in its winter darkness, the bridge lights reflected in the black water, the city spreading out beyond in every direction. From here he could see most of the room without having to navigate it, which was a habit he'd developed in large social situations years ago and never entirely lost. He spotted Raymond Holt 20 minutes in. Raymond was 71, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been physically powerful and still carried the architecture of it, with white hair and the kind of face that had learned over decades to give nothing away for free. He was standing with Derek, which wasn't surprising, and with 2 men Mason didn't recognize who had the particular quality of people accustomed to being in rooms where decisions got made. Raymond's eyes moved through the party with the systematic attention of a man taking inventory. When they reached Mason, they paused for approximately 2 seconds before moving on. 2 seconds was enough. Mason understood, with the clarity that sometimes came from being the quietest person in a room, that this evening had a shape to it that had been planned before anyone arrived. Derek and Raymond had come with an agenda. The question was what that agenda looked like when it was deployed, and whether it was aimed at Olivia directly or at Mason as the more exposed target. He was still working through this when Olivia arrived. She came in from the elevator at 7:45, which was later than expected for a CEO at her own company party, And Mason understood immediately why she'd timed it that way. Arriving late meant moving through a room that was already settled into its patterns rather than having to anchor the beginning of the evening. It was a control move, small and smart, the kind she made without seeming to. She was wearing something simple and dark that Mason didn't have the vocabulary to describe specifically, only that it was right in the way that some things were right. Not trying too hard, not performing occasion, just clean and direct like she was. Her hair was down, which was unusual. She looked like herself and also like something Mason needed a moment to absorb. She moved through the room doing what CEOs did at company parties. Brief conversations, genuine enough attention for each one to feel real. The professional warmth that was also, Mason had come to understand, not entirely performed. Olivia actually liked most of the people who worked for her. That wasn't a strategy. It was just true. She found him near the north windows at 8:15. "You came," she said, which was a slightly strange opening given that he'd told her he would. "I said I would." "I know." She stood beside him looking at the river view, close enough that he was aware of her the way he'd been aware of her since the cafeteria, that particular heightened attention that he'd stopped pretending wasn't what it was. "Raymond is here." "I saw. He's been talking to Derek for 40 minutes. "I noticed that too." Olivia turned her glass in her hands. "Water," he noted, same as him. "They're going to make a move tonight. I can feel it." "What kind of move?" "I don't know yet. That's the part that's—" She paused. "That's the part I can't see clearly." Mason looked at the room. Derek was now moving toward the center, the cluster around him growing, and there was a quality to his movement, a purposefulness just beneath the social surface, that confirmed what Olivia was feeling. Something was being set up. "Whatever it is," Mason said, "you know what you're doing." She looked at him sideways. "That's unusually straightforward reassurance for you." "I mean it specifically. You've been running this company for 2 years against people who thought they should be running it instead. You're still here. They haven't moved you." He kept his voice even. "Whatever tonight is, it's not bigger than that." Olivia held his gaze. "You know that's the most words you've said to me in a single stretch in weeks." "I had a point to make." "You usually do." Something in her expression softened, not visibly to the room, just to him, the small shift he'd learned to read. "Thank you." They stood at the window for another few minutes in the comfortable silence that had become one of Mason's favorite things about their friendship, or whatever it was, the fact that silence between them had texture and ease rather than the anxious weight it had with most people. Around them the party moved and murmured, and neither of them rushed it. Derek Holt moved at 8:45. Mason saw it unfold in stages from the north windows. Derek calling the room's attention with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, tapping a glass, producing the particular silence of a party that's been interrupted by someone with social authority. A speech, it appeared. Informal, unscheduled, the kind that got forgiven if it went well and remembered if it didn't. "Colleagues," Derek said, his voice carrying the room easily. He'd always been good at rooms, Mason had to grant him that. 12 months, another year at Hartwell. I want to take a moment. He looked at Olivia with a smile that was technically warm and actually not, to recognize some of the extraordinary work this team has done. A round of applause, shouts genuine from some people, performed from others. Derek moved through a list of departmental achievements, partnerships numbers, digital growth figures, a new distribution deal that had closed in November. All real, all accurate, all framed in a way that positioned Derek's sphere of influence as the primary driver. Mason watched Olivia's face while Derek spoke. It was composed, completely, impressively composed. But he'd learned her face well enough to catch the small tell, a slight tightening at the corner of her right eye, almost invisible. The tell of someone holding something carefully still. And of course, Derek continued, shifting register with the practiced ease of a man pivoting from praise to point. A year like this doesn't come without its challenges. Leadership decisions that affect all of us, decisions that, a brief weighted pause, require us to think about what Hartwell stands for, what kind of company culture we're building. The room had gotten quieter. Not silent, a party doesn't go silent, but quieter in the way that happens when people sense that something is happening and aren't sure which direction to look. Raymond Holt was watching Olivia. Culture, Derek said, starts at the top. And I think we all want to make sure that as Hartwell grows, the standards that made us successful, professionalism, clarity of purpose, appropriate boundaries between leadership and staff, he let the phrase land, continue to define how we operate. It was elegant, Mason thought with a cold clarity. Technically unsayable against. General enough to deny a specific target. Specific enough that everyone in the room who'd seen the cafeteria video or heard the hospital stories or noticed the fourth-floor break room visits understood exactly what it was aimed at. The room waited. Olivia set her glass down on the window ledge beside her, a small, deliberate motion. She walked toward the center of the room. The space opened for her the way it always did, not because she demanded it, but because she was who she was, and people felt it. Derek registered her approach with a smile that didn't move far enough up his face to reach his eyes. "Derek," Olivia said pleasantly, "thank you for that." "Of course. I'd like to add a few things, if you don't mind." Not a question. Derek stepped back. He didn't have a choice that wouldn't have been obvious. Olivia turned to the room, and Mason watched her do the thing he'd been watching her do for months. The thing that Raymond Holt and Derek had fundamentally miscalculated about, which was that Olivia Bennett under pressure did not contract. She expanded. 12 months, she said, and her voice was clear and unhurried. This team delivered. The numbers Derek mentioned are real, and the people who produce them deserve exactly the recognition he gave them. She paused, letting that sit. "I want to add something else, though, about culture." A beat. Raymond Holt was very still. "My father built this company with a specific belief, that the quality of the work depends entirely on the quality of the people, and the quality of the people depends on whether they feel seen, valued, and treated with basic dignity." She looked around the room, not performing the look, actually making contact. "I have not always succeeded at that. I made a mistake in this building earlier this year that reminded me how quickly carelessness can cost someone their dignity." Mason went very still. "I'm not going to relitigate it," Olivia continued, "but I want to say clearly, in front of everyone, that the culture standard I'm holding this company to starts with me. It starts with how I behave, and it includes the expectation that people in positions of influence," she didn't look at Derek, didn't need to, "do not use their position to make others smaller." The room was genuinely quiet now. "What I will not do?" Olivia said, and something shifted in her voice. Not louder, just more direct. The way certain statements become when a person stops managing them and simply says them is allow the language of professionalism to be used as a tool to police who I talk to, who I value, or how I choose to live my life outside of my obligations to this company. Those are not board agenda items. They are not appropriate subjects for company speeches. She let that land. "And anyone who disagrees with that is welcome to bring their disagreement to me directly. My door is open." She picked up her water glass from the ledge where she'd set it and looked at the room with the expression of someone who has said what they came to say and is done performing. "Happy holidays," she said pleasantly. "The bar is open." The party reassembled itself. Not immediately, not without the specific charged quality of a room that had just watched something happen. But it reassembled. Music resumed. Conversation restarted. Derek Holt found somewhere else to be with the practiced invisibility of a man retreating without appearing to retreat. Raymond Holt crossed the room. Mason watched him come. The broad-shouldered walk. The face that had learned to give nothing away. Raymond stopped in front of Olivia and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and Olivia looked back with the same patient stillness. "Your father," Raymond said finally, "would have handled that differently." "Yes," Olivia agreed. "He would have. He was better at managing rooms than I am." A pause. "He was also wrong sometimes, and I learned from that too." Raymond considered her. His eyes moved briefly to Mason, standing at the windows. A scan, a registration, a calculation completed. Then they moved back to Olivia. "You're going to make this difficult," Raymond said. "I'm going to run the company well," Olivia said. "If those two things overlap for you, that's information worth having." Raymond held her gaze for another beat, then nodded once. Not agreement, not endorsement, just the acknowledgement of a man recalibrating, and moved away. Olivia stood where she was for a moment after he left. Mason watched her take one careful breath, just one. And then she turned and found him across the room and held his gaze. He crossed to her. That was either very brave or very stupid, he said quietly. Probably both, she said. My father's assessment of me applies. You okay? She thought about it honestly, which was a thing Mason appreciated about her. She didn't reach for the automatic fine. My hands are shaking, she said. Internally, I don't think it shows. It doesn't. Good. She let out a breath. Raymond is going to take this to the board. Maybe. Not maybe. Definitely. Then you'll handle the board, Mason said. You've been handling them for 2 years. She looked at him. Mason. Yeah. When I said... She stopped. Started again. The thing I said about not allowing anyone to police who I value. I heard it. I meant it specifically. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. Something was open in it that was usually more contained. I wasn't making a general statement about corporate culture. She paused. I was saying something true out loud in front of 200 people because I was tired of saying it only to myself. The party moved around them. Voices, music, the city visible through 3 walls of glass. Mason was aware of all of it at the periphery, and aware of almost nothing except the woman standing in front of him and the specific quality of her honesty, the way it asked for nothing and contained everything. I know, he said. You know, she repeated. I've known for a while, calm. She looked at him with the expression he'd been seeing in unguarded moments for months. That complicated mixture of wanting something and being afraid of wanting it, the specific fear of a person who had built their life on competence and control and was standing at the edge of something that was neither. She started. I'm not good at this. I want you to know that in advance. I'm good at a lot of things, and I'm not particularly good at this. Neither am I, Mason said. I haven't been good at it in about 4 years. That's not reassuring. I know, I'm telling you anyway. She almost laughed. That real laugh, slightly undignified, the one she couldn't entirely control. This is the least romantic conversation I've ever had. It's honest, Mason said. Yes, she agreed. It is. They stood in the middle of the Hartwell Media Group Christmas party while Chicago blazed cold and bright beyond the glass on every side, and Mason looked at Olivia Bennett. Not the CEO on the lobby photograph, not the woman managing a board or a room or an expectation, just the person who had sat in plastic chairs and listened about elephants and texted about Arctic terns and showed up at a pageant and held his daughter's hand during the scary owl costume. And he said, simply and without ceremony, I'm in love with you. Olivia was completely still. I've been in love with you since the hospital, he continued, and I've been not saying it for 2 months because I was afraid of what it meant for your career and Sophie's stability and 7 other practical considerations that are all real. But Harold told me something about living small enough to avoid risk, and Sophie sends me elephant emojis when she thinks I'm doing the right thing, and I'm done waiting for the circumstances to be clean enough. Olivia looked at him for a long, long moment. You are, she said finally, without question, the most maddening person I have ever met. Because I waited too long, or because I said it at a Christmas party? Because you made me fall in love with you by being exactly yourself, and then acted like that was something I might not have noticed. She said it with a directness that had no performance in it at all. I've been in love with you since the cafeteria. I just needed significantly longer to admit it than you apparently did. Mason looked at her. Since the cafeteria? You told me I didn't have to do something I didn't want to do, Olivia said. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Not like that. She held his gaze. I didn't know what to do with it. I clearly still don't. That makes 2 of us, Mason said. And then, in the middle of the 42nd floor of a building on Wacker Drive, in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, with 200 Hartwell Media Group employees somewhere in the same room, Mason Reed kissed Olivia Bennett for the 2nd time. Not because someone dared him, not because a room was watching, because it was true, and because he was done being careful with something he didn't want to be careful about anymore. She kissed him back, and this time there was no silence, no held breath from a crowd, just the 2 of them, and the city beyond the glass, and the particular relief of finally arriving somewhere you'd been walking toward for a long time. When they pulled back, Olivia looked slightly undone in a way that she probably would have managed better if she'd had more warning. The board is going to hear about this by Monday morning, she said. I know. Raymond is going to... I know. And Derek, Olivia. He held her gaze. I know. And it's still true. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed. The real one, slightly undignified and completely genuine, and shook her head in the way she did when something exceeded her capacity to manage it. Okay, she said. It's still true. Okay, Mason said. They stood there, and around them the party moved through its final hour, and neither of them looked to see who was watching, because the watching didn't change what was true, and what was true was enough. The aftermath came in waves, as aftermaths tend to. The board meeting request arrived in Olivia's calendar on Monday morning, as she'd predicted. Raymond had convened a special session for the following Wednesday, agenda listed as leadership conduct and company culture review, which was the corporate language of a formal confrontation. Olivia spent Monday and Tuesday building her case the way she built everything, methodically, without panic, with the specific precision of someone who had known this was coming and had been preparing for it longer than anyone outside her office understood. What Raymond had not anticipated, and what Derek had not anticipated, was Priya Summers. Priya walked into Olivia's office on Monday afternoon and closed the door and said, "I've been documenting Derek's conduct for 14 months. I'd like to share it with you before Wednesday." Olivia looked at her. "Why didn't you share it before?" "Because I was waiting to see whether you were going to be the kind of CEO who needed it or the kind who didn't." Priya set a folder on the desk. "You needed it about 6 months ago. I should have moved sooner." Olivia looked at the folder. How comprehensive is this?" "Comprehensive enough," Priya said, "that Raymond Holt's options on Wednesday are significantly narrower than he currently believes they are." It was comprehensive. Mason didn't see its contents, but he heard from Priya, in the carefully phrased way that Priya communicated anything significant, that Derek's pattern of conduct around hiring decisions, expense manipulation, and the engineering of Mason's overlooked promotions was documented with the specificity of someone who had been keeping records since well before it became clearly useful to do so. The Wednesday board meeting lasted 3 hours. Mason spent those 3 hours at his desk doing his actual work, because there was nothing else he could do, and because the work was real regardless of what was happening upstairs. Tyler hovered at the cubicle perimeter at intervals, visibly restraining himself from asking for updates, which Mason appreciated. At 4:15, his phone buzzed. "Still here, call you tonight." Oh, at 6:45, when Harold had put Sophie to bed and the apartment was quiet, Olivia called. "He resigned," she said. "Derek, Raymond gave him the option of resigning or facing a formal conduct review that would become public record, and Derek resigned." Mason sat at the kitchen table. "And Raymond?" "Raymond and I had a conversation." A pause. "A real one. Not the board performance version. She stopped. His son had been doing things under Raymond's protection that Raymond didn't fully know about. When Priya's documentation made that clear, it changed things." Another pause, shorter. "I don't think Raymond and I will ever be exactly aligned, but I think we understand each other better than we did." "That might be enough." "It might be." She was quiet for a moment. "The financial strategy position, the one Scott Ellery got. I'm reopening it. The posted qualifications are being revised. The review committee is changing." She said it carefully, the way she'd said she wasn't going to interfere. "I'm not guaranteeing anything. The decision goes through proper process." "I know," Mason said, "but the process will be clean this time." "That's all I ever wanted," Mason said. She was quiet again, and in the quiet Mason could hear her breathing. She'd clearly left the office, was somewhere with ambient sound, the particular quality of the city at night. "I had my assistant clear my Friday evening," she said, with a casualness that didn't quite land casually. "If you didn't have plans." "Sophie has a sleepover at Emma's on Friday." "I know. She texted me." Mason closed his eyes briefly. "Sophie texted you. She wanted to make sure I was aware of her schedule." A pause. "She also said, and I'm quoting, 'My dad is better when he's not lonely,' which is either very insightful or very manipulative." "With Sophie, it's always both," Mason said. Olivia laughed, and Mason sat in the kitchen listening to it, and the evening settled around him with the particular quality of things that had been wrong for a long time, and had finally, imperfectly and without ceremony, started to become right. Not fixed, not finished, just started. He didn't know what Friday would look like, or the board, or the job process, or the thousand variables that made up a life being built in real time with another person who was also building in real time. He didn't have a clean framework for it, and probably wouldn't for a while. But Harold had told him something about standing 20 feet back from the edge like there was nothing worth seeing, and he'd crossed a room once before when everything in him said to stay seated, and Sophie sent elephant emojis when she approved of his choices, and the woman on the phone was laughing about his daughter's matchmaking campaign with the real laugh, the one she couldn't control. It was enough to move forward with. It was, in fact, more than enough. Friday came the way important evenings tend to come. Quietly, without announcement, disguised as an ordinary end to an ordinary week until you were already inside it. Mason dropped Sophie at Emma's house at 5:30. Sophie had packed her backpack with the systematic efficiency of a child who had been looking forward to this sleepover since Tuesday and had strong opinions about which stuffed animals were appropriate for overnight travel. The elephant came. 2 others were evaluated and left behind. She kissed Mason on the cheek at Emma's front door and then turned back once before going inside, looking at him with her mother's eyes and her own particular 7-year-old wisdom. "Have fun, Dad," she said with a weight to it that suggested she meant something slightly more than the words. "Go inside, Soph." She grinned and disappeared through the door. Mason sat in the cab back toward the city and watched the neighborhoods move past the windows and thought about what Harold had said to him months ago in the new apartment. Stop standing 20 feet back from the edge like there's nothing worth seeing, and thought about how long it took some people to learn a thing they already knew. He'd known what he felt since the hospital. He'd known it before the hospital, probably, if he was being honest with himself in the way that cost something. The cab dropped him 2 blocks from Olivia's building because the traffic near the river was doing what Chicago traffic did on Friday evenings, which was commit fully to being impassable. He walked the 2 blocks in the cold with his collar up, the lake wind coming from the east, the city lit up around him in its December way. Not the Christmas lights anymore. Those had come down after New Year's, just the ordinary nighttime illumination of a city that never fully went dark. He buzzed up from the lobby at 6:47. "You're early," Olivia's voice said through the intercom. "I said 7. It's 6:47. That's 13 minutes early. I miscalculated the cab." A pause. "I'm not ready." "That's fine." Another pause, shorter. The door buzzed open. Her apartment was on the 14th floor, which Mason had never been to before. He rode the elevator with the particular awareness of someone crossing a threshold for the first time. Not nervous exactly, just present, conscious of the specific weight of where he was in the story of his own life. The elevator opened onto a hallway with 4 doors and the muffled sound of a city existing 14 floors below. Olivia opened the door before he knocked. She was in the process of being not ready, which meant she'd changed out of work clothes but hadn't finished with whatever came after. Her hair was down and slightly unresolved. She was barefoot. She had a dish towel over her shoulder that she was clearly holding because she'd been in the kitchen when the buzzer rang. She looked, without any of the professional architecture that usually surrounded her, like a person who lived in an apartment and cooked dinner and occasionally got flustered when guests arrived 13 minutes early. It was the most human Mason had ever seen her look. "Come in," she said, stepping back. "I made pasta. I should tell you up front that I make pasta because it's the one thing I can cook reliably. Everything else I attempt is risky." "Pasta is fine," Mason said. "I also want to say, before you come in, and it gets weird to say it, that I don't do this a lot." She was looking at him with the directness she always had, but underneath it something was less composed than usual. "Have people here. I don't want you to think I do this constantly, and you're just..." "Olivia," Mason said. "Yeah, I know." She held his gaze for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was smaller than he'd expected, which surprised him, and then immediately made sense. She spent 14-hour days in a large office with a city view and came home to something human-scaled and manageable. It had the quality of a place that had been furnished to actually live in rather than to impress. A couch that was clearly comfortable, bookshelves that were overcrowded in the way of someone who bought books faster than she finished them, a kitchen that smelled of garlic and something with white wine. On the kitchen counter, slightly propped against the backsplash, was a small framed photograph. Mason looked at it. It was a security camera image, slightly grainy, the angle from above and to the left, the way security cameras always were. 2 people standing in the middle of a cafeteria. One of them had just kissed the other. The other was about to kiss back. He looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. I got it from building security in August, Olivia said from behind him, slightly careful. I kept it because I couldn't stop looking at it. I couldn't figure out why until... She paused. Until I could. Mason turned around. She was leaning against the kitchen door frame with the dish towel still over her shoulder, watching him with the expression he'd come to understand as the one that came out when she'd stopped managing what her face did. Why? He asked. She considered how to say it. Because you looked at me like a person, she said. Not a CEO. Not a dare. Not a situation to manage. You walked across that room and you said I didn't have to do something I didn't want to do, and then you did exactly what you wanted to do with complete calm, and then you walked away. She paused. I had never had someone do that. Not once. Mason looked at her. You kept a security camera photo on your kitchen counter for 5 months. It's been a complicated 5 months. It has, he agreed. She pushed off the doorframe. Sit down. The pasta needs another 8 minutes. He sat at her kitchen table while she cooked, which was not something he'd done before with Olivia, watched her do something ordinary in an ordinary space, the particular domestic reality of another person's kitchen on a Friday night. She moved through it competently but not gracefully, in the way of someone who cooked for function rather than pleasure, and she talked while she did it, about the board, about Raymond, about what came next. The board meeting had gone, as Priya had predicted, significantly better than Raymond had expected. Derek's conduct file had been presented through Priya and 2 other senior staff members who had agreed to corroborate the timeline, and the picture it produced was of a man who had been using his position systematically and over a long period. Raymond, faced with documentation rather than narrative, had done what practical men did when evidence was clear. He recalculated. Derek had resigned effective immediately. He was gone from the building by Wednesday evening, which produced a specific quality of change in the atmosphere on every floor, a loosening, like something that had been braced against a wind that had stopped. Raymond asked me in private after the meeting whether I was planning to stay long-term, Olivia said, draining the pasta with the focused attention of someone making sure not to burn themselves, or whether this was a transitional tenure. What did you tell him? I told him I was planning to run this company for the next 15 years and that he should make his peace with that or find a different investment. She set the colander in the sink. He said my father had the same approach to difficult conversations. Is that a compliment from Raymond? Coming from Raymond, that might be the closest thing to one I'll ever get. She brought the pan to the table and served with the slightly approximate precision of someone who had cooked this particular dish enough times that the measurements lived in her hands rather than her head. He also asked, obliquely, whether I was planning to formalize my personal situation in a way that would create additional board concerns. And she set the pan down and looked at him across the kitchen table. I told him my personal life would be conducted with integrity and that anyone who required more specifics than that was in the wrong meeting. Mason looked at her. I also told him, she added, sitting down, that in my observation, people who were loved well tended to do better work, and that if he had data contradicting that, I was interested to see it. You told the board that. I told Raymond, in private, with pasta sauce on my blazer because I'd been cooking when he called, which probably undermined the authority of the statement somewhat. She picked up her fork. The blazer is at the dry cleaner. Mason looked at his pasta and then looked at Olivia, who was eating with the slightly distracted energy of someone who had been moving fast for a long time and hadn't quite fully stopped yet. Her hair was still slightly unresolved. The dish towel was still over her shoulder. The security camera photograph was on the counter behind her. Thank you, he said. She looked up. For the pasta? For all of it, he said. The hospital, Sophie's pageant, the board, the photograph on your counter. He held her gaze. For staying. She was quiet for a moment, turning her fork in her hand. You said that to me once, that what mattered was that I stayed. You did stay. So did you, she said simply. You didn't make me smaller to make yourself more comfortable. You didn't disappear when things got complicated. You just... She paused. You just kept being yourself, steadily, even when it would have been easier not to. That's not a particularly impressive achievement. You'd be surprised, she said, how rare it is. They ate dinner at her kitchen table and the conversation moved the way their conversations always moved, freely, without agenda, covering the city infrastructure article she'd finished that morning, Harold's most recent creative interpretation of his dietary restrictions, a book she'd been trying to finish for 3 months and kept putting down because the ending seemed too neat to be believed. Mason told her about the financial strategy application, the revised one, through the clean process, and the work he'd put into it, and she listened without interfering, which was what he'd asked for, and what she'd delivered, even when it clearly cost her to not act. "I don't know if I'll get it," Mason said. "You're the most qualified candidate." "That didn't help me last time." "Last time the process was broken," Olivia said. "It's not broken now." "Then we'll see," he said. Not resigned, just honest. Some things you did right and waited on, and the waiting was the part you couldn't control. And Mason had spent enough years learning which things were and weren't within his control that he'd mostly stopped catastrophizing about the gap between them. "The worst case," Olivia said carefully, "is that you don't get it, and you find something better somewhere else and—" She paused. "And?" he asked. "And that doesn't change anything here." She said it looking directly at him, the way she said things she'd decided not to dress up. "I want that to be clear." "It's clear," Mason said. "Good." They were quiet for a moment. Outside her windows, the city moved through its Friday night version of itself. Sophie told Emma's mom, Mason said, that her dad was finally dating his boss. Olivia closed her eyes briefly. "Sophie." Emma's mom told Sophie that was impressive. Emma's mom isn't wrong. Sophie was pleased about that. Olivia shook her head, but she was smiling, the real smile, the one that was slightly crooked and came from somewhere genuine. "Your daughter is... she's something. She's her mother's stubbornness and my tendency to say the exact thing that needs saying at the exact wrong moment," Mason said. "It's a specific combination." The smile stayed. "She sounds like someone else I know." "She's better at it," Mason said honestly. "She hasn't learned to be afraid of it yet." The evening moved in the way of evenings that are later remembered as important, not because of anything singular, but because of the whole quality of them. The texture of ordinary time spent with a person you want to spend it with, talking about nothing and everything, the city outside doing its unremarkable nighttime thing. They moved from the kitchen to the couch at some point, which was the natural drift of a dinner conversation that wasn't ready to end, and the space between them on the couch closed by increments without either of them making a decision about it. At one point, Olivia fell asleep. Just went. Mid-sentence, which told Mason everything about how tired she'd actually been, how much she'd been running on and how little she'd been stopping. One moment she was saying something about the preservation case for a near-north building, and then her voice trailed off, and her head was on his shoulder, and she was asleep with the absolute totality of a person who had been holding everything together for a very long time, and had finally, in this particular place, with this particular person, let go of it. Mason didn't move. He sat on Olivia Bennett's couch, with her asleep on his shoulder, and the city doing its quiet nighttime breathing outside her windows. And he thought about the version of himself from 8 months ago. The one sitting alone in the back section of the cafeteria with a chicken sandwich and a spreadsheet, invisible by habit, tired in the bones, getting through things because getting through things was what he'd learned to do. He thought about how strange it was that a stupid dare, a moment of other people's carelessness, had put him in motion towards something real. That the worst version of being seen, publicly, without consent, as someone's joke, had somehow led to being seen, fully and honestly, by one specific person who mattered. He didn't have a clean philosophy about why that was. He just knew it was true. He sat with that for a while, and then he fell asleep too, which was its own kind of answer. The financial strategy position came through in February. Mason got the email on a Tuesday. Again a Tuesday. Again at his desk. But the feeling this time was entirely different. He read it twice, same as before. But this time the second reading confirmed what the first had said, rather than trying to make it mean something different. He called Harold from the stairwell. "I got it," he said when Harold picked up. A pause. "The job." "The job. Well," Harold said, and Mason could hear the particular quality of an old man trying to contain something and not quite managing it. "Good. That's good, Mason." "Yeah." "Your father would have—" Harold stopped. "I know," Mason said. They stayed on the line for a moment without saying anything, and that silence had more in it than most conversations, and Mason held it carefully. "Sophie's going to lose her mind," Harold said finally. "She already knows. She texted me 3 elephant emojis before I called you. Harold laughed. A real one. The kind Mason hadn't heard enough of in the months since the stroke. That girl. Yeah, Mason said. That girl. He did tell Olivia, and she did not pretend she wasn't pleased, and she also did not pretend she'd had nothing to do with fixing the process that had twice prevented him from getting what he'd earned. She had fixed the process and kept her hands off the outcome, which was the distinction she'd drawn and which Mason had asked for and which she'd honored even when it cost her something to wait. That was its own kind of love, the kind that understood where its edges were. The promotion meant a different floor, different colleagues, different direct reports. Mason moved out of the 4th floor cubicle on a Thursday afternoon, packing the modest contents of his desk into a box. A photo of Sophie, a photo of Harold, a coffee mug that had survived 2 years of terrible break room coffee, and Tyler appeared at the edge of the cubicle looking mournful in the way of people who feel entitled to more ceremony than circumstances provide. This is it, Tyler said. It's 1 floor up. Symbolically, it's huge. Goodbye, Tyler. You could at least look sad. I'm not sad, Tyler. I got promoted. Tyler pointed at him. Remember the little people. Mason picked up his box. You get $400 a day in consulting fees for your fantasy football advice. You're not the little people. He took the elevator to floor 5, found his new desk, put the photos of Sophie and Harold where he could see them from his chair, and got to work. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did. Reluctantly, in fits, the lake still cold enough to generate serious wind well into April, while the trees went stubbornly ahead with their plans regardless. Mason noticed spring that year in a way he hadn't noticed it in a while, which he attributed to the general change in his baseline state of being. Things that had been white noise, the particular green of new leaves on the trees along his street, Sophie's interest in keeping the windows open to hear birds, Harold's daily complaints about allergens that were somehow preferable to his winter complaints about cold, registered again as specific, particular, real. He and Olivia had, over the months since the Christmas party, built something that resisted neat categorization, and which Mason had stopped trying to categorize because the categorization was less important than the thing itself. She had dinner at his apartment on Thursdays when her schedule allowed, which was not every Thursday, but was often enough that Harold had opinions about her cooking, and Sophie had developed a standing request that she bring the good bread from the bakery near her building, which Olivia always remembered. Harold had decided, at some point in January, that he liked Olivia. He'd communicated this by addressing her by her first name without being asked, a distinction that mattered to Harold and that Olivia had seemed to understand was significant without needing it explained. He'd also once, when Mason was in the kitchen and Sophie was elsewhere, told Olivia that she was the first person he'd seen make his grandson look like he wasn't carrying the whole world by himself. Olivia had told Mason about this later, in the specific, careful way of repeating something that had moved her more than she'd expected. He said that? Mason asked. In fewer words, Olivia said. More gruffly, but that was the meaning. Mason thought about his grandfather saying that and felt something quiet and enormous move through him. He doesn't tell people things like that. I know, I could tell. She paused. I think that's why it meant something. Sophie, for her part, had integrated Olivia into her understanding of how their family worked with the flexibility that children sometimes had about these things, not treating it as an event, just as a fact, the way children accepted new true things about the world once they decided the thing was real. She asked Olivia questions with the same directness she asked everyone questions. She shared elephant facts with the assumption that this was welcome, which Olivia had given her every reason to believe. She had once shown Olivia a drawing she'd made at school, a family portrait, crayon on construction paper, 3 figures outside what was presumably their apartment, and a 4th figure that was clearly meant to be someone in a dark coat. Olivia had held that drawing for a long moment without saying anything. That's you, Sophie had clarified, pointing, with the helpful explanation of someone who understood that adults sometimes needed things made explicit. I know, Olivia said. Thank you, Sophie. She had kept the drawing. It was on the counter in her apartment, next to the security camera photograph, which had been joined over the months by other evidence of the life she was living. A ticket stub from a Chicago Architecture Foundation tour they'd done in March. A postcard Sophie had sent from a school trip to Springfield. A photograph from the farmer's market in November that neither of them had taken, but that had appeared one day without ceremony, printed and framed, apparently by Harold, who had been given a smartphone for Christmas and was using it in ways that surprised everyone. The thing Mason had come to understand, slowly and without being able to point to a specific moment when the understanding arrived, was that love after loss was not a replacement for what had been lost. It was not a second-best arrangement or a proof that the grief had healed into something clean. It was its own thing, new, specific, built from different materials, carrying different weight, asking different things of him. His wife had been real, and their life had been real, and her absence was still real, and that was all still true. It did not disappear because something else also became true. He had tried to say this to Olivia once, imperfectly, on a night when Sophie was asleep, and Harold was watching his naval documentary, and the two of them were sitting on the couch with the city outside doing its thing. "I don't talk about her a lot," he said. "Julia." Olivia had been very still beside him. "You don't have to." "I know. I want to." He thought about how to say it right. "What I feel about you, it doesn't undo anything. It doesn't mean what I felt before was smaller. It means—" He stopped. "It means people are apparently capable of containing more than one real thing at a time, which I didn't used to believe." Olivia had been quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind?" "Sophie," he said, "watching her love Harold and love the memory of her mother and walk into new things without deciding in advance how much she was allowed to feel about them." He paused. "She's better at it than I am because she's never learned to be afraid of it yet. I said that before, I know. It keeps being true." Olivia had looked at him for a long moment and then said something she hadn't said to him before, which was, "I would have liked to know her, Julia." It was the right thing to say, which was Olivia. The ability to find the exact honest thing and say it without performance. "She would have taken 3 days to warm up to you," Mason said, "and then she would have had opinions about your blazer collection." "What kind of opinions?" "Evaluative ones, positive mostly." A pause. "She liked people who were specific about things. She would have respected how specific you are." Olivia absorbed this. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'm glad." The company's annual gala was held in May, in the same Wacker Drive building as the Christmas party, this time with the windows open to the river because May in Chicago was magnificent when it cooperated, and that particular May had decided to cooperate. The event was different from the Christmas party in the ways that evening events in late spring were different from winter ones, lighter in tone, the city visible beyond the glass in its best version, the long golden light off the river. Mason arrived without the pre-arrival calculation of December, without the suit assessment in the bathroom mirror, without the strategic positioning near the north windows, without the awareness of where Derek Holt was standing. Derek was gone. Scott Ellery had quietly transferred to a different department and seemed, from Mason's peripheral observation, considerably more relaxed. Raymond Holt attended, but had converted his attendance into something that looked more like genuine oversight than territorial assertion, which was the negotiated peace that Olivia and Raymond had arrived at, and which held, imperfectly and with ongoing maintenance, the way most negotiated peaces did. Mason got a drink, actual drink this time, a glass of something cold, and moved through the party with the ease of someone who had been in enough rooms to know that rooms didn't define him, that the person in the room was the point, not the room itself. Priya found him near the windows at 8. "Financial strategy is producing better numbers than projected," she said, by way of greeting. "I know," Mason said. "I work there." She looked at him with her particular evaluating attention. "You're different from when you started," she said. "Different how?" "Less like someone waiting to be told they're allowed to take up space." She said it clinically, not unkindly. "More like someone who knows the answer to that already." Mason considered this. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," Priya said. "I make observations." "I've noticed," Mason said, and she almost smiled, which was the Priya version of warmth. Olivia found him at 9:15. She came from across the room, the way she moved through rooms when she wasn't performing anything. The particular unhurried directness of someone who knew where they were going. She was in something the color of the river at dusk, and her hair was down, and she was carrying 1 glass of wine and 1 glass of water, and she handed him the water because she knew he was driving Harold to a 9 a.m. cardiology appointment the next morning and didn't want to feel slow. He took the water. She kept the wine. They stood at the windows overlooking the river the way they'd stood at the windows in December, But this time the river was gold with the May evening light, and the city was full of sound, and the distance between them was not the careful, negotiated distance of two people managing something unspoken. "Good night?" she asked. "Getting there," Mason said. She looked at him sideways. Sophie texted me. "About what?" "She wanted to know if you danced yet." A pause. "I told her no." She said, and I'm quoting, "Someone should do something about that." Sophie has a great deal of opinions about things that are not her business. She's 7. Everything is her business. She's almost 8, Mason said. Her opinions will only get more detailed. Olivia looked at the river, then back at him. She set her wine glass on the window ledge. "Well," she said, in the voice she used when she'd made a decision and was implementing it without making a production about it, "Sophie asked me to do something about it." The music was something slow. There was always something slow at galas, always a moment designed for exactly this kind of thing. Olivia held out her hand, and Mason looked at it for a moment and thought about all the moments that had added up to this one, and the thought was brief and honest, and then he took her hand and they danced in the Wacker Drive building overlooking the Chicago River in May, while the city did its beautiful, indifferent thing all around them. They weren't graceful. Olivia had told him once she'd never been a good dancer, and this proved accurate. She was slightly stiff, slightly ahead of the beat, concentrating more than the situation required. Mason was not significantly better. Harold would have had commentary. Sophie would have found it hilarious and taken a photograph. But it was real, which was better than graceful. It was the two of them, imperfect and present, in a room full of people who had mostly stopped trying to define what they were to each other, because what they were had become self-evident over months of break rooms and hospital waiting rooms and school gymnasiums and kitchen tables and an apartment couch at 1 a.m. "You're thinking something," Olivia said, because she'd learned his face the way he'd learned hers. "I'm thinking about the cafeteria," he said. She looked at him. "The kiss." "The moment before it," Mason said, "when you were walking toward me and I was standing up and I had no idea what I was doing." He paused. "I just knew I was tired of sitting there." She was quiet for a moment, moving with him through the music. "I knew, walking across that room, that something was going to be different after it. I didn't know what. I just knew." "And was it?" She looked at him with the expression she'd had in the office when she'd said, "It's still true." Open, direct, without management or performance. "Everything," she said. "Everything was different after it." They danced badly through the rest of the song and then stood at the window with her hand still in his, and the city spread out below them in the May evening, the river catching the last of the gold light. And Mason thought about a thing he'd come to believe over the past year. Not a conclusion he'd arrived at cleanly, but one that had built itself from evidence, the way honest conclusions did. He'd spent 4 years learning to carry weight alone, and he'd gotten very good at it, and that skill had been necessary and real, and he didn't regret it. But there was a difference between being capable of carrying weight alone and deciding alone was the only way to carry it. He'd confused those two things for a long time, hidden the confusion under the language of practicality. Sophie's stability, the margins, the manageable structures, when what he'd actually been doing was protecting himself from the specific risk of letting another person matter. The risk was still real. That hadn't changed. Olivia could leave, or circumstances could change, or the 100 unpredictable variables of two people's lives could fail to align in ways that mattered. Harold's health was a variable. Sophie's needs would shift as she grew. Olivia's company would have crises that had nothing to do with Mason, but that would take her away from him in ways he couldn't predict. All of that was true. And it was also true that she had walked across a cafeteria and said something he hadn't been able to stop thinking about for 8 months, and that she had sat in a hospital chair listening to his daughter talk about elephant social structure with her phone in her pocket, and that she had a security camera photograph on her kitchen counter and a child's crayon drawing of their family next to it, and that she fell asleep on his shoulder because she trusted him enough to stop holding herself together in his presence. Those things were also true, both sets of things at once. That was the thing about love. Not the fairy tale version, not the version where everything aligned perfectly and the difficult parts dissolved because the feelings were strong enough. The real version, the one that asked you to hold risk and reality and the full complicated weight of another person's life alongside your own, not because the weight was light, but because the weight was worth it. Because the alternative was standing 20 feet from the edge, seeing nothing. Harold had told him that. Sophie had shown him it. And Olivia, who felt things too much for the business world and kept security camera photographs and learned elephant facts and stayed through the ugly chapters. Olivia had given him the specific evidence he'd apparently needed to believe it. Across the room, someone had started taking photographs. Event photographer, moving through the gala, catching the standard record of company occasions. Mason didn't notice until Olivia did, and she turned slightly toward the camera with the reflex of someone practiced at being photographed. And then she stopped, and instead turned back to Mason. And what the photographer caught, what would later appear in the internal company newsletter that nobody read except obsessively after this, was not the CEO posture, not the professional presentation, just Olivia Bennett looking at Mason Reed, the way people look at something that is specifically, particularly, irreplaceably theirs. He didn't see the photograph until 2 weeks later when Sophie found it on the company website and printed it at the school library and brought it home and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Illinois. Mason stood in the kitchen looking at it. Sophie stood beside him assessing her work. "It's good," she said. "Yes," Mason agreed. "You both look happy." "We were," Mason said. Sophie nodded, satisfied with this answer, and went to find Harold so she could tell him about it. Mason stood at the refrigerator looking at the photograph. The two of them in the May light, the river behind the windows, Olivia's expression that the camera had caught before she'd managed it. He thought about the cafeteria, the dare, the silence that fell over the room, the moment he'd stood up and crossed the floor not knowing what he was walking toward, only knowing he was tired of sitting still. He thought about all of it. The hospital, the break room, the bad coffee, the security camera photograph on her counter, the plastic chairs, Sophie's elephant, Harold's recliner, the Christmas party speech, the terrible dancing in May. He looked at the photograph on his refrigerator, held there by a magnet shaped like Illinois. Then he heard Sophie in the living room saying, "Grandpa Harold, look, it's a picture of Dad and Olivia, and they're not making weird faces," and Harold saying something back in the tone of someone trying to sound unimpressed and failing, and the apartment was full of the small, ordinary sounds of people living in it. And Mason thought that this, exactly this, imperfect and complicated and real, was the thing that had been worth walking across the room for. Not the ending, not the resolution, just this. The ongoing, ordinary, irreplaceable this. He put the kettle on because Harold liked tea in the evenings and went to join his family in the other room.